In the darkness, a crack and falling glass are visible. A bright white light was breaking through the hole. A century ago, the heavens opened up, dungeons appeared. In front of the bright blue portal stood several monsters. A huge dragon with dark scales who opened his mouth. A demon with dark horns on his head and a yellow eye on his forehead who screamed in rage. An orc with purple patterns on his green skin who opened his mouth wide, holding a wooden bat and a shield in his hands. The monsters that came out of the dungeon could not be defeated with ordinary weapons. The city was burning with fire. In front was a demon with red skin and 3 faces. His eyes glowed with a yellow light, and he extended his red hand forward. The only ones who could fight the monsters were people in whose bodies supernatural abilities awakened at the same time as the phenomenon. A man wearing a purple cloak and a sword with a black sheath and purple hilt. He had a hood on his head and at the back were golden beads with 2 green crystals on the ends. A guy with blonde hair and a purple cloak raised his sword above his head. Below him were the dead bodies of other monsters. A girl in a brown suit was holding a small yellow light over her hand. And in front of the dead bodies of monsters stood a man in a white shirt, lowering a heavy axe to the ground. These people were called Awakened. Thanks to them the world gained stability, monsters, mana, and a new civilization took root. The crowd of people cheered, raising their hands up. The girl clasped her hands together and with a wide smile, and tears in her eyes turned to the guy who was standing nearby. Some of the awakened ones became hunters whose job was to destroy these monsters. Tens of years later, it appeared whether there were too many hunters. The eyes of the guy with blonde hair, the girl sitting next to her, the fire on whose hand disappeared, and the man with the axe widened in confusion. Once the secret mechanism was revealed, it became possible to artificially awaken people, so that anyone who had enough money for it could use it. A thin guy with a bandage on his arm sadly lowered his head. John Dowie, a previously insecure weakling, an arrow was leading from him. A pumped-up guy smiled confidently, with his hands on his hips. Behind his back was a huge sword. Now he is a cool awakened one who definitely won't stay unnoticed. A phone on which there was a photograph of a man with a sword, in front of whom stood a crowd of people. On the bottom it was written, "Important news, S-Class Hunters." In front of him stood a girl in a long purple dress and a purple pointed hat, who walked along the red carpet, falling from the sky money that was being thrown around by a guy with a red gun with money, smiling widely. He was wearing red glasses with lenses in the shape of a letter W. There was an inscription at the bottom, "Good end of the story for a professional hunter. Reality may differ from the image above." The guy in the white shirt pointed forward. There was a black stripe on his eyes and he asked you to, yes, exactly that. And the heyday of the great era of hunters began. Many people crowded in front of a huge blue portal. They were holding various weapons. Some asked not to push, some to let them through, some shouted that a man had fallen here. There were obvious problems, so the government instituted a professional examination. In a large hall, a man sat behind a wooden counter. Many other people sat in front of him at tables, and only those who passed the exam were allowed to become an active hunter. Many sheets of paper that were covered with various notes. The teacher at the green board pointed at it. A student was sitting at a desk in front of her. Of course, educational institutions appeared in which they prepared for passing this exam. A man with dark short hair held a dumbbell on his shoulders, squatting, while a trainer stood next to him with his arms crossed on his chest. There they provided all the necessary information. The students were trained. A girl with long blonde hair and white clothes, with his back to her with his arms crossed on his chest, stood a man in a breastplate and an iron helmet, with horns and a golden pattern. In the end, private institutions appeared. A guy with green hair and glasses was reading a green book with a smile, around which there were translucent chains. Institutes train future professionals in their field. Such institutions began to be called hunter academies. Someone was heard coughing and drops of blood were visible. Above the guy with black hair stood a huge dark dragon. He was holding his severed paw with his paw. The dragon had blood stains on his body. The guy in front of him was holding a long spear from which lightning came. The dragon asked how such a person could exist. The guy with black hair and blue eyes smiled, saying that maybe he was just a frog in the well. Cutting through the air, the dragon swung its huge tail with a sharp tip. He hit the ground with his tail, shouting that he refused to accept this, opening his mouth wide. The guy with the spear jumped in front of him. Red lightning struck around him. The dragon's purple eyes glowed brightly as he extended his clawed paw to become a hunter. Now one must attend the academy. The guy appeared behind the dragon, raising his spear to strike, fragments of stones flying nearby. He swung his spear sharply, the blow from which glowed with a bright red light. The dragon staggered back and a huge stone fell on him. Among the rubble of stones, bright purple light and dark fog emerged from the cracks. Having got out of the stones, the dragon opened its mouth wide, and a huge powerful cloud of fog burst out of it, which moved towards the guy who was standing with a spear. The guy smiled, looking at the cloud of fog that was approaching him, and thought about the establishment he would go to. A man standing with his back, around which there was a purple mist. His quote below read, "Fists defying the heavens. If you can hold them, you can turn them over, Professor Atlas." A man with his hair tied up, wearing a red yukata, who was holding a needle. At the bottom there was a quote, "I did not allow you to die, Professor Huatu." A man with a staff and a book, who was dressed in blue robes and a pointed hat. Next to him was a quote, "Once you know mana, you will see the whole world, Professor Merlin." A guy with green hair and a green cloak. He was wearing brown armor and a hat. There was a quote next to him, "Faster than anyone, unlike anyone else, forward, faster than the speed of light, Professor Tealfie." A man with closed eyes and a smile on his lips. He had dark curly hair and a red crystal in his forehead. Next to it was a quote, "The moment your mind falls, strength will be nothing more than useless dust, Professor Gautama Buddha." A man standing with his back, with a long weapon on his shoulders, who turned over his shoulder. His golden eyes were visible. Next to him was a quote, "Take the stars of the world of the gods and find yourself in the upper heavenly Devalox, the great Professor Sage." The main character smiled, holding a spear in both hands with a smile, from which bright white lightning came. He thought that the establishment was in a completely different dimension than all the others. Black stones flew into the air, lightning flashed nearby. A long body of a dragon could be seen on the ground, with lightning sparkling around it. The guy walked away from it with a smile, holding a spear on his shoulder and closing his eyes. He looked at his phone while holding it in his hand and smiled widely. There was a notification on the blue system window that said whether you would like to sign up for a class, and the guy asked out loud what class he should take. He pressed his finger on the yes button. Blue pixels walked across the blue system window. It was written on the system window, "The lesson begins. Thank you for choosing the Transcendent Academy." The main character, wearing an orange work uniform and an orange helmet, looked down, a drop of sweat running down his face. The sun shining brightly from the sky. Kim Sojun, 27 years old. The main character held two dead round creatures on his back. The construction of a building could be seen behind him. He is the only one awakened. At birth he was granted more power than the others, but in order to pay off the debts of his parents who died in an accident shrouded in secrets, he has been working for 9 years transporting killed monsters. The guy loaded the dead monster onto the truck, and another man helped him, standing on top of the truck. There is only one thing that helps Kim Sojun withstand such hard work and the psychological pressure of debt. His dream of becoming a professional hunter. Kim Sojun stood, wiping his face with a white handkerchief. The second man in an orange uniform turned displeasedly at him, shouting something. The guy approached two men who were sitting on a stone. One of the men in a white t-shirt handed Kim Sojun a red jar, asking him to take a break and asking how he was doing with money and becoming a hunter. The main character replied that he was still looking for a good academy, but inexpensive not so much. The second man turned around in shock and loudly asked about the Hunter Academy. The bald man frowned, asking if the main character couldn't become one, if only because he was awakened. The second man with a gray beard sighed and raised an eyebrow, saying that this exam for hunters has been established for 50 years. Visiting the academy is now mandatory. You won't be able to shirk. Kim Sojun raised a can of soda to his mouth and thought that this is true. Most of the teachers in these academies are active hunters. They share their experience, teach all sorts of cool tricks that you need to know before risking your life. The guy thought about a lot of people. A tall man with dark hair, a guy with blonde hair with a blue cloak, a guy with green hair and round glasses. On top there was a poster that said, Hunter Academy. A record number of applications submitted. The man looked at these people and Kim Sojun thought that because of this, a huge gap had formed between the uneducated and those who graduated from the academy. The man was on his knees. A guy with blonde hair and a blue cloak walked forward into the bright light, casting a shadow on the man behind. The time had come when in order to become a hunter, you must study at the appropriate institution. Kim Sojun looked at his phone with a smile and thought that there was finally something else. There was a bank on the phone. The name Kim Sojun was at the top and the balance at the bottom. $40,000. The guy thought that now he had enough money for a year of studying at the academy. Kim Sojun smiled. Sitting on the iron beam, a bright yellow light shone around him and the man turned to the guy with a smile. Kim Sojun thought that he would like to go to a better place, but they are too expensive. And this place is not that bad. The guy looked at the phone screen. There were 2 notifications with inscriptions. The title, advertisement, Transcendental Academy, promotional message, Transcendental Academy, video link. Kim Sojun asked what this was. Was it really an advertisement? He said that this was the first time he had heard about such an academy. Gautama Buddha with thumb and forefinger pressed together. Behind him was a bright hoop with other men visible behind him. System windows showed. A paradigm has shifted. Transcendental rage is about to hit the universe. Experience and knowledge carefully selected by teachers who are over 10,000 years old. Individual assignments for every student. A guy with blonde hair, wearing blue clothes and with a large sword on his back. He smiled widely when a microphone was brought to him. In the corner it was written Transcendental Academy. Interview with a student. On the blue stripe at the bottom it was written, student who passed the 9th Sword Master exam class. He registered here, not expecting anything good. But entering this academy was the best decision of his life. A man in blue clothes who showed a thumbs up and a heart with his fingers. His eyes were also covered with a black stripe. He had a long gray beard. On the blue stripe at the bottom it was written, a student who passed the 5th grade Sage Ascension exam. Thank you Transcendental Academy. Above the phone there were many system windows on which it was written. The legends about the past tests will continue to exist. If you want to join their ranks, register now. Life has turned upside down. Thank you. He has changed for the better after joining the academy. A blue sign that says anyone can become one of them. The screen on the phone went dark. Kim Sojun looked at it, holding it in his hand. His eyes turned white as he opened his mouth in shock, mentally asking who thought of creating this advertisement. The guy was scrolling through the screen on his phone, saying that their website was the same as any other academy, and that all the teachers had the same names. Quotes from professors were shown. The moment your mind falls, strength will seem no more than useless trash. Professor Gautama Buddha, fists that defy the heavens. If you can hold them, you can turn them over. Professor Atlas, once you know mana, you will see the whole world. Professor Merlin, anyone can become super strong with this training. Professor Hercules, the basics of wielding a staff and a spear. Professor the Great Sage. Kim Sojun said that we should see what a teacher with that name is like. The monkey with the golden tiara and red beads smiled as he waved his hand. Kim Sojun trembled, snorted loudly and covered his face with his hand, holding the phone next to him, from which came the voice of the professor, who said that he was a great sage, but his real name is Sun Wukong. His main weapon is the Rui staff, but sticks and spears are fundamentally not very different from him. On the phone, Sun Wukong was holding a stick, smiling, and the guy said that the lesson looked normal, given its concept. The professor asked it was difficult to understand the theoretical explanation. He said that this happens, and for starters, deflecting movement. Sun Wukong waved his hand, which became human, causing dispersion. He said that he should then rotate the staff back inward. In the place of the monkey stood a man with white hair and a beard. One of his eyes was glowing with a yellow light, and the staff he was holding in his hands was shining with blue lightning at the end. The man said capture. Sun Wukong said that finally, you need to pierce the enemy with one movement at a certain point. A powerful pulse of blue energy passed across the ground. Blue lightning shone in the air. Sun Wukong shouted pierce. Kim Sojun looked at his phone screen in shock, frowned and asked what it was, and the mountain just disappeared. The guy stood up, holding the phone with both hands, and loudly asked if it was CGI, and it didn't look like it. It was impossible even for S-class hunters. A blue system notification appeared, on which it was written whether the guy wanted to sign up for a class, and the lesson was taught by a great sage, as well as a sign-up button at the bottom. Kim Sojun looked at his phone screen in confusion. His mouth parted. He pressed his finger on the sign-up button. A system window appeared on which it was written, an error, he is not a member of the academy. On the second system window it was whether he wanted to register an account. On the third system window an inscription appeared that he could pay the membership fee. The fourth system window showed that his registration fee will be calculated, taking into account his situation. Kim Sojun thought that it was really worth the money for them to even create an account. And what kind of situation? Another system window appeared, on which it was written, registration membership fee, $40,000. After registration, the fee for classes may change depending on the specific case. Kim Sojun leaned closer to the phone screen, squinting, saying that it was 40, 400, 4,000. He moved away from the phone, looking at it displeasedly, holding it at arm's length, and asked again about 40,000. Blue sky with white clouds floating across it. Kim Sojun shouted that they were just charlatans. A man with a gray beard looked to the side, holding a dead monster on his shoulder, and asked if he was going to enter the academy. The man loaded the monster onto the guy's back, saying that that's why he was in such a good mood. The man asked what kind of institution it was. Kim Sojin smiled, closing his eyes, and answered that it was called the Ark, and he heard that the teachers there were nothing like that. The crane held a platform on chains on which a huge monster lay. Moving it, the man told the guy not to forget about him when he gets rich. Kim Sojin replied that of course. And will he deal with the monsters that he caught? The man replied that it sounds great. And will he finally get the dragon? Kim Sojin smiled, looking over his shoulder at the man, and waved his hand, saying that not only that, he could even play football with his skull. The guy walked along the platform, above the crane that held the platform with the monster. He thought that someone once said that life seems like a comedy from afar. The chain broke and the corpse of the monster flew to the ground. Someone loudly called Kim Sojin, and he turned around with a surprised face, mentally continuing that life is a tragedy if you look closer. The sound of a blow was heard. Kim Sojin, with a sad face and a plaster on his cheek, he thought that in order to laugh sincerely, you need to accept your pain. A doctor in a white coat and glasses sat at a table. Next to him was a screen on which there was a picture of a bone. He said that he had necrosis of the nerves in his legs, and it seemed that the broken bones were enveloped in nerves during the healing process, all due to rapid regeneration, because he is awakened. The man in the black and orange uniform frowned with displeasure and waved his hand, shouting that there would be no compensation, and what would happen to the reputation of his nephew and him if the world found out about what happened at their enterprise. A medical lamp that had a bright light coming from it. Someone said the surgery would cost $40,000. It had to be done as soon as possible. If they waited any longer, the nerves would be permanently attached to the bones, and there was nothing else they could do. The man held out a white envelope, asking him to take it. Kim Sojin thought that you need to be able to look far into the future. The guy was sitting on a hospital ward. His leg was in a green cast. He was clutching a white envelope in his hands, thinking about what he was looking into while he endured this hellish labor for 9 years. The guy clutched a white envelope in his hand, saying that all his savings were spent on the operation, and all he had left was the $3,000 that Mr. Manchel gave him. The main character's eyes dimmed and he looked forward while his phone next to him rang. He wondered if he could go through this again. The guy looked to the side at his phone. There were blue notifications on it that said, "The past of all transcendentals is always insignificant. So there is a special offer for new students. If he registers now, he will receive a completely free pass." The guy said, "This the same Academy of Transcendentals." Kim Sojin held the phone in his hands, looking at it, and thought that after that day there was no way he could find her again. The blue system window indicated that his registration fee would be calculated taking into account his situation. Kim Sojin looked at the screen of his phone. The blue window showed the registration membership fee is $3,000, and after registering, the class fee may change based on his specific case. Kim Sojin asked about $3,000, and wasn't it $40,000 last time? The guy looked at the phone in confusion, saying that if you think about it, then those $40,000 were the only thing he had, and do they really want to take everything away from him? Kim Sojin smiled, looking at the phone screen, and thought, why not try to register? He said that there was nothing on the account anyway. The system window showed a notification that membership was confirmed. The guy turned around in fear. A green light shone around the envelope. Money was flying out of it. Kim Sojin shouted that the money was flying out of the envelope. The system window showed congratulations to the guy on entering the Transcendent Academy. The guy's eyes widened as a small man with white hair appeared above his phone, purple energy flying around him. Kim Sojin looked down at him with his mouth open, muttering that someone had gotten out of his phone, and the person on the phone said that he was glad to meet him, and the guy was Kim Sojin. The main character's eyes turned white in shock, and he opened his mouth wide when the little man told him that he was his mentor in charge of primary education. The guy, with white hair and purple eyes, smiled widely, saying that his name was Mentor. Mentor looked at the guy with a smile, standing on the phone, his eyebrows knitted together. Kim Sojin looked down at him, pursing his lips. He held his phone, which had a man on it, and asked him to say that his mentor's name was Mentor. The man jumped over the phone, smiling widely, and he replied that he was Mentor, his mentor. The guy with white hair put his hands on his hips and, smiling broadly, said that he was his mentor. This is him, Mentor, and his name is Mentor. The main character remembered the stone sculpture of Odysseus. It was written below, Odysseus, the hero of Greek mythology. And Kim Sojin said that maybe he is not just a mentor, but a mentor, Odysseus's teacher, and Mentor happily said that this is how the main character knows him. The guy with white hair smiled smugly, shaking his head and crossing his arms over his chest, saying that Odysseus was his first student, whom he mentored, and a lot of time has passed since Odysseus became transcendental, but he still sometimes contacts him. The main character thought, what's happening? Mentor cleared his throat, put his hand to his face and said it didn't matter. Frowning and putting his hand to his chest, the guy with white hair looked at the main character, saying that in their Academy of Transcendence, they train those who want to go beyond the boundaries of their race. Kim Sojin looked at him in surprise. His mouth parted. Kim Sojin looked at the little man in surprise, asking if this was an Academy of Transcendence, not hunters. The phone was on his lap and Mentor fell there. The guy with white hair smiled, leaned his hands on the phone and sighed, asking how they could even be compared and saying that they were on completely different levels. Kim Sojin raised his hand, looking at his mentor in confusion, and said that they were still S-class hunters. Mentor was typing something on his phone. He raised the phone in front of the main character's face, frowning and saying that their instructors were capable of dealing with hunters with one finger. No joke, in one way or another, he needed to fill it out. A large system window was displayed on the phone, on which there was Transcendent Aptitude Test. Survey to create a personalized course for new students. B1. Select the area in which the student wants to transcend. 1. Combat. 2. Production. 3. Medicine. 4. Mind. 5. Art. 6. Other. Kim Sojin scratched the back of his head, holding the phone in his other hand, and asked in confusion what it was. Mentor was flying next to him, smiling widely, and answered that in this way they will see what kind of transcendental he wants to become, and they will also be able to determine his current level and inclinations, as this survey is written. The guy's eyes turned white and he let out a confused sigh. Mentor said that this was necessary to give him the best recommendations, so you need to answer as honestly as possible. The main character chose option 1, fight on the system window, thinking what was going on. Kim Sojin's finger froze over the phone. He hummed questioningly, looking at him, Mentor flying at his shoulder, looking at his phone and asking if he had any problem. Kim Sojin put his hand on his head and closed his eyes, saying that he did not know what to choose in the second question. On the blue system window it was written, B2, select your skill level. 1 is close to transcendence. About 2% is missing. 2 has become the strongest a person in the world, but not in history. 3 with his blow is able to clear a plane. 4 with one jerk he can split a mountain in 2. 5 cannot split a mountain, but at least pull it out of the ground. Mentor smiled, closed his eyes and said that many people doubt here, and he can choose something that literally reflects his abilities. Mentor raised his arms above his head and bent one leg, asking if he could clear the plane with his strongest blow. Kim Sojin shook his head and answered no. Mentor waved his fist with a smile, saying that perhaps he could split the mountain in 2 with one jerk. Kim Sojin looked at him and shook his head again, saying that no, but he could climb it. The guy with white hair turned to him questioningly, asking in confusion what it meant that he couldn't pull a mountain out of the ground. The main character answered him that it seemed to him that it sounded even stranger. Kim Sojin scratched the back of his head in confusion, looking at the phone screen, while Mentor opened his mouth in surprise, wondering how he managed to register for their academy. The guy with white hair pointed forward and winked at the main character, saying that it's okay, and don't worry too much, the Transcendent Academy will never expel its student. The guy with white hair waved his hand and told him to continue answering questions with a wide smile. Mentor clapped, praising Kim Sojin. He flew over the guy who tiredly put down the phone. His eyes turned white and his hair disheveled when he asked why there were 108 questions in the test. Kim Sojin wiped his forehead with his hand, holding his phone up, and Mentor looked into it, saying that the guy has a free pass and he can recommend a few mandatory lectures for him, but they will discuss everything else after they analyze his profile. Kim Sojin agreed. The spear, which was surrounded by blue energy, Mentor put his hand to his chin, saying that his preferred method of fighting is to fight with a spear, and to wield a spear instead of cultivating mana. It would be better to choose the Eastern Kai technique. The white-haired guy closed his eyes and frowned, saying that the great heavenly sage was best suited to learn the basics, but considering that the main character couldn't even lift a mountain, it would be too difficult for him. Mentor said that for a free pass this would be the best solution. 2 blue system windows appeared on which it was written, when your psyche collapses, physical abilities turn into garbage. Instructor, Siddhartha Gautama. On the second it was written, a mandatory training course for martial transcendence. Instructor, Chiron. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek when Mentor said that in addition to his wounds, he had mental problems. Mentor leaned on the guy's shoulder, smilingly saying that why not start with the lecture of Instructor Siddhartha Gautama. Kim Sojin's eyes turned white when he repeated this name in confusion. The guy shouted, "What is he talking about, Buddha?" Mentor replied that everything is true. He denies it, but all the students address him that way. The main character with a shocked expression on his face thought about Buddha, who closed his eyes. A golden halo was flying around him. Next to it was written, "Return to Amida Buddha, Buddha of endless light and life." Below there was a postscript, "The founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama." Mentor crossed with a satisfied smile hands on his chest and said that due to his psychology lectures he is one of the most famous instructors and his subject is compulsory for the Transcendence exam and usually a huge amount of money is required to attend this lecture. But Siddhartha Gautama insists so much on saving the poor souls. The guy again thought what was happening. On the blue system window there was an inscription whether the main character wants to register for this lecture. Upon completion of the lesson he will receive an unshakable SSS heart. The guy held the phone in front of him, asking about the unshakable heart. Mentor flew in front of him, saying that this is the reason why the instructor's lecture Siddhartha Gautama is considered essential. It can help him succeed in almost any direction of transcendence. The guy with white hair winked and gave a thumbs up, with a wide smile saying that even if it seems like he's going crazy, he needs to watch it to the end. Kim Sajin asked again about him going crazy and Mentor just replied that he would understand when it started. Mentor disappeared, leaving behind glowing blue figures, saying that he would contact him after he analyzed the profile of the main character. He extended his hand to him and asked him to wait. Kim Sajin scratched the back of his head and said that he would probably have to take a look at the lecture. On the blue system window there was an inscription to press the button to start playback and an icon to start the video. Buddha sat with his eyes closed. There were green tree leaves above his head. He asked how they thought their world existed. The main character looked at the screen of his phone, holding it with both hands and asked if this is really Buddha and he looks like a living golden statue. Buddha with his eyes closed in the video continued that the word "I did not exist, therefore I do not exist." Kim Sajin thought that this lecture was too difficult. Buddha was sitting by a tree that cast a shadow on him. He said that if there is nothing to compare with, then how can something that cannot be defined exist? The guy looked at the phone screen, floating in space, remembering Mentor winking at him and asking if he was talking about this. Buddha continued that thus, this world and this universe were created the moment they were born. They will only die then when they die. A translucent image of Buddha with his eyes closed, next to which the main character was hovering. Buddha said that he does not exist. He is the world. The guy thought that it seemed to him that he was starting to go crazy. The blue system window showed that the lecture was 0.06% complete. Kim Sajin sat on the hospital bed, pale, and a ghost emerged from him. A week later, in the White Hospital building, the doctor with glasses said in confusion, "What an amazing recovery rate." Kim Sajin stretched out his hand with a smile, turning to the doctor, and he adjusted his glasses, saying that he of course understands that the guy is awakened. But still, in 30 years of working as a doctor, this is the first time he has seen something like this. Kim Sajin smiled, looking at the doctor, and thought that he was not imagining it. The guy sat on the hospital bed, holding the phone in his hands, and thought that thanks to the lesson of Siddhartha Gautama, his heart knew peace, which increased the speed of recovery. Although every time he listened to the lecture, his mind seemed to leave him. The lesson was only completed by 1.3%, and the effect is already amazing. The doctor peered at the papers, bringing the tablet with them to his face, and said that you never know what can happen, and why don't he stay in the hospital for another week or two? Kim Sajin looked at him with a smile, thinking about what would happen when he will listen to the entire lecture. Smiling broadly and looking at the doctor, he agreed with him, thinking that the Academy of Transcendence was no joke. The guy raised his hand to the phone, saying that now he will be able to move his body, and why not at the same time look at Chiron's lecture. There were two system windows on the phone. On the first it was written, "A mandatory training course for combat transcendence, instructor Chiron." On the second it was written if he wanted to enroll in this lecture, and upon completion, he would receive metamorphosis. Kim Sajin lay on the hospital bed, raising the phone above him and putting his other hand under his head, thinking about great a metamorphosis, and compared to the unshakable heart rank quite small, but far from a high-level skill. The main character remembered Mentor, who said that with an unshakable heart, any direction of transcendence will become a trifle, and thought that most likely an unshakable heart is simply too powerful. A man with a beard and pointed ears said that he was pleased to meet you and his name is Chiron. Chiron, he is a centaur, a creature with the torso of a human and the lower body of a horse. Chiron cast a shadow, a man with a cloak tied around his body and long hair. Hercules, a man with a bow, and in Roman armor who was pulling an arrow on the string. Theseus, a guy with hair covering his face and holding a ball of thread. Achilles, a guy in long robes, holding something made of wool. Jason and others. Chiron was the teacher of almost every hero in Greek mythology. A man with the body of a horse. He had blue eyes and light brown hair. The teacher of the heroes is Chiron. The man said that the purpose of this lecture is to prepare students to the stage from which they can move to the early levels of transcendence. Kim Sajin smiled, closing his eyes and holding the phone above him, while Chiron said that he asks to note that this course will cover martial techniques superficially. The guy thought that this was the real Chiron, and he was almost not surprised. Chiron cleared his throat, closing his eyes and saying that the first step to becoming a transcendental. The main character opened his eyes, looking questioningly at the phone screen. The man clenched his teeth in anger. Chiron's face contorted with rage and his blue eyes glowed brightly as he loudly shouted for him to quickly get up and walk. Kim Sajin shuddered in fear, screamed and dropped the phone from his hands. From the White Hospital building, Chiron shouted to move faster. The main character looked ahead in confusion with a shocked face. He was lying on the floor, his legs remained on the bed, his phone lay next to him, making the sound of an incoming notification. 2 system windows appeared, on which it was written that a new daily task had been received. On the second system window it was written that the task was being adapted to the current level of the student. A third system window appeared, on which the daily task was written, as well as a list of tasks: running 30 kilometers 0 out of 30, 1,000 squats 0 out of 1,000, 300 push-ups 0 out of 300, 300 press 0 out of 300, 150 pull-ups 0 out of 150. Kim Sajin held the phone in his hand and asked about the assignments. He scratched the back of his head, standing on the floor and looking at his phone, asking if this would happen every day. The guy smiled nervously, remembering that the doctor said something. He remembered the doctor who raised his finger, telling the main character to try not to overexert himself over the next week. Kim Sajin yawned and closed his eyes, pressing the phone screen. He said that for now he would just listen to lectures and would study when he was discharged. A blue system window appeared, on which it was written that an uncompleted task was detected. The student must complete the task. The main character smiled, closed his eyes and pressed the phone screen again. The same notification appears. An unfinished task is detected. The student must complete the task. The guy sat on the edge of the hospital bed, tapping on the phone screen, causing many notifications to appear with the same message. Incomplete assignment found. Student must complete the assignment. Kim Sajin screamed. How do they even know he didn't do anything? The guy lowered his head, his figure turned pale. Kim Sajin closed his eyes and smiled, thinking that everything was lost, but doing nothing would not solve it, and he had no need to push himself. The guy opened a page where there were videos of Buddha, saying that then he would listen to Buddha's lectures first. Under one of the videos from Buddha, there was an inscription that the free pass will end in 83 days. The main character ran along the treadmill. With tears in his eyes, there was an inscription above him that the free pass would end in 83 days, and the guy realized that this was how he was given for a while. A lamppost, green trees were visible behind. Kim Sajin said that no matter how you look at it, the Transcendent Academy is also an academy. It's logical that they don't have everything for free. Kim Sajin sat down, stretched and lowered his head and said that there were 83 days left, and apparently 90 days were initially given. The guy thought that he did not know how this academy worked, but it seemed that in order to increase progress, he must absorb knowledge and reach a certain level of understanding. Kim Sajin remembered looking at the window on which it was written that the lecture was 1.3% complete. He said that he had listened to the video, but there was no progress. The guy thought that he had listened, but nothing had changed. The guy remembered sitting on a hospital bed, holding the phone with both hands with white eyes and thinking that he had listened to Buddha's lecture over and over again for a whole week, but the progress remained the same. Kim Sajin exhaled, closing his eyes and thinking that he doubted that at 83 he would be able to complete this course. Raising and bending his hand, the main character stretched it, putting his other hand on his shoulder and looking to the side, saying that the free pass was something like a trial period, and he had not trained for a long time. The guy thought that in truth, until this moment he had not. I didn't see the point in training. The guy leaned on the ground, saying that he would start with push-ups and began to count from 1. He thought that after all, for 9 years he had been carrying monsters killed by hunters. Kim Sajin remembered walking around in an orange uniform with 2 monsters on his back and thought that the monsters weighed about 70 kilograms. so he had no need for additional exercise. The main character sank to the ground, doing push-ups. Drops of sweat flowed down his body, falling to the ground, and he thought that although he does not know how to use magic, he is still awakened and he is confident in his strength. The guy loudly shouted the number 300. He shook off the dust from his palms. Kim Sojin wiped his forehead with his palm and picked up the phone in his other hand, closing his eyes, saying that compared to years of grueling work, and then asked what was next on the list. In the list of tasks for the main character, an item with 300 push-ups was highlighted, next to which 81 out of 300 was written, and the guy asked how it was. He smiled and scratched his head questioningly, asking why only 81. He did 300. The main character leaned on the ground again. On the phone screen it was written 81 out of 300. The guy did a push-up and the number changed to 82 out of 300. Next to it there was an icon with the inscription +1. Kim Sojin stood on the ground, looking at his phone while holding it in his hand. The guy clenched his teeth, frowning. His body trembled as he did push-ups. Next to it was an inscription, 300 push-ups, 300 out of 300. Kim Sojin was doing pull-ups on the bar, trembling. Next to it was written, 150 pull-ups, 150 out of 150. The guy tremblingly squatted. From below 1,000 squats were written, 1,000 out of 1,000. He lay on the ground with his hands behind his head and pulled himself up on it. Next to it was written 300 abs, 300 out of 300. Kim Sojin shouted that imperfect ones don't count. The main character, with white eyes, ran through the park, his mouth wide open, and shouted, how does this even work? Next to it was written running 30 kilometers, 30 out of 30. The main character was holding his phone in his hand, on which the daily tasks that he completed were open. Kim Sojin fell to the ground in the middle of the park. People were passing nearby. Some boy said that his uncle was lying here, and his mother said not to look at him. The main character closed his eyes, shouting that this was some kind of madness and he couldn't stand it anymore. The sky was dark, the moon was visible. With tears in his eyes the guy shouted that this should be done every day, and when he listened to lectures, Chiron picked his ear, saying that this was not his problem. A couple of days later, the old woman with curly hair turned around in surprise, saying that he was getting prettier every day. Kim Sojin stood in a red tracksuit and black pants, looking at the old lady who asked him if he was going to practice again. The guy answered in the affirmative, asking how the old lady was. The woman clapped her hands, looking at the guy, and said that she was working hard. He smiled at her and nodded. A voice was heard that announced urgent news, and said that today at 5 in the morning a 4th-level giant was discovered in Seoul. Kim Sojin drew attention to this. He looked at the TV, where a man stood in front of the yellow and black protective tape, saying that the association claims that he was in hibernation, which, as it turned out, the monster transport service did not know, and so the giant ended up in the center of the city, where he woke up from his sleep. On the screen, 2 people stood next to the black monster. The man stuck a sword into the monster, and the girl stood nearby. A voice from the TV said that many could have died. Kim Sojin looked at the TV, listening to the host say that by pure chance there was an awakened one nearby who repelled the monster's attack. The old lady, the main character, and the man on the chairs looked at the TV, which said that the Gaon Academy student was awakened, and thanks to Young Hyun Yoon, an S-class hunter. The old lady muttered that the hunters saved them again. She looked at the TV, saying that these were great people. The woman turned to Kim Sojin, asking if he was also awakened, and the guy looked at her, answering yes. The woman took the guy's hand with both hands and smiled, asking if he was a hunter and would someday be shown on TV. The guy smiled awkwardly at her. A voice was heard from the side saying that the woman really thought that the news was showing who was hit, and Kim Sojin's eyes widened. He and the old woman looked at the man, who was looking at the guy with a dissatisfied face, clutching a newspaper in his hands. The man said that now it is very difficult to become a hunter, and the chance is 1 in a million. The old woman looked at him in surprise and said that everything has changed so much and it was different in her time. The man raised an eyebrow at the guy and asked how he was. Kim Sojin looked at the man, who turned to him, saying that he doesn't even study at the academy, and is just wasting his time on training. He won't become a hunter and he needs to give up. The main character remembered how he worked, carrying dead monsters, and how he worked while the man told him that he shouldn't waste his youth on unrealistic dreams. Kim Sojin frowned while listening to this. Kim Sojin clenched his hands into fists while the old woman pointed her finger at the man, asking how he could even turn his tongue to say such a thing. The man answered displeasedly that he just wanted to help. The main character said that he would decide for himself what to do. The man clenched his teeth and hand into a fist, frowning and saying that he had lived his whole life. Kim Sojin stood over the man, frowning, and said that then let him get on with his life and not interfere with his. The man looked at the guy in fear, his shadow looming over him. Kim Sojin walked back to the exit while the man angrily shouted how rude he was. And by the way, it's worth listening to the advice of elders. The guy thought that the pipe dream was nonsense, and he was a student at the Transcendent Academy. And within a week he felt the effect of the training, and at the Transcendent Academy he could become a professional hunter. The main character frowned, breathing heavily, drops of sweat running down his face. He ran on the treadmill, saying that he would definitely become a hunter. The girl with black hair lowered her head and said how tired she was of being a hunter. She stood in front of two huge manticores with black skin and purple wings. The girl put her hand on a sword in a black sheath. Blue energy was flying around. The girl said that everything costs money. She struck with a sword that left a blue light. Blue lightning and splashes of blood flew nearby. The girl screamed that there were almost no students. The sword was stuck into the Manictora's body. It was stained with blood and the girl exhaled loudly. She stood on the body of a Manictora whose paw had been cut off. Another one lay next to its open mouth. Small sparks of lightning were flying around and the girl said that you could die of boredom. The bloody paw of a manticore. The road beneath it was also muddy. Night. A 5-story building with lights burning in the windows. The main character fell onto the white sheets and said loudly that he was finally home. He remembered the doctor who adjusted his glasses and said in confusion that in just 2 weeks, the guy was kneeling on the floor and laying his head on the bed, wearily saying that he had been in the hospital for 2 whole weeks and his apartment was small, but the best. The guy looked forward, lying with his cheek on the bed. Drops of water were dripping from the tap nearby and Kim Sojin said that there was still a year before the hunter's exam. There was a black bag lying near the front door, and the guy asked how much money he had left in his account. A red lattice window, which is covered with dust, in which you can see a guy in his apartment. The guy pressed his cheek to the white sheets, looking forward and muttered that he had nothing at all. Rising sharply, Kim Sojin took his phone in his hand and said that he had already finished the task. The guy scrolled through the system window, on which the mandatory introductory course on combat training for Transcendence was written. He thought that he had no time to watch the lectures, because the next day had already begun and maybe today it would work out. On the blue system window there was an inscription, proceed to the next lessons and options yes or no. Chiron smiled, closing one eye and raising an eyebrow, saying great. The man said that it looked like he had finally learned to walk. The main character was confusedly holding the phone in his hand and asked if he thought it was a baby. Chiron raised one hoof, holding a spear in his hands and closing his eyes, and said with a smile that in this case it was time to take the first steps. The man looked forward seriously, saying that the first step on the path to becoming a transcendent is feelings. A system notification appeared indicating that the lecture was 5.7% complete. The next morning, a large white building. There was an iron fence around it. Someone said that he thought he needed some kind of complex operation, but it turned out to be some kind of trifle. A man in an orange and blue uniform stood with his arms crossed on his chest, displeasedly saying that he was deprived of his intelligence, since the guy decided to return here. And if this happens again, he will not get off so easily. Kim Sojin bowed low next to him, thinking that he didn't want to go back, but he has no choice and he doesn't even have anything to eat. He frowned as he watched the man leave, thinking that, apparently, he felt guilty. Even if just a little. He remembered how the man asked about compensation for the injury, frowned and said that he was fine, but he was whining so much, and how the man pointed forward, saying that he knows nothing. A small iron room with 2 windows and a blue door. The main character was sitting on a bench, his head on his hand. Next to it was the inscription Kim Sojin the Thinker. The guy said that after all, it all comes down to money, and if he doesn't work, he won't have anything to eat, and if he works, there won't be time to study. The guy frowned, his eyes turned white, and beads of sweat ran down his face when he said that if he didn't complete his daily tasks, then Chiron wouldn't be able to listen to lectures. The guy was holding the phone in his hand, thinking that maybe it was worth at least reviewing past classes, and that Chiron spoke about feelings in the last lecture. A man in a white t-shirt with gray hair came inside the room. The man looked towards the guy. Chiron's voice was heard, which said that the key role in battle is played by the 5 senses: vision, hearing, touch, taste and smell. Everyone is familiar with these 5 senses. The man looked at the main character, who was sitting with his back to him. Chiron stood on the water that washed the sand in waves, crossing his arms on his chest and holding a spear between them. continuing that regardless of the feeling, first they perceive the stimulus, then recognize it and draw a conclusion. But this is too slow, why think about such useless things? And he will teach you how to speed up this process as much as possible. Chiron opened his mouth, a shadow falling on his face as he said that they would know something that was completely different from these 5 senses, hidden within them. Kim Sajin looked at the phone screen that was reflected in his eyes while Chiron said that the 6th sense is intuition. The man in the white t-shirt smiled broadly, waving his fist towards the guy, who dodged him and said that he at least warned him that he would come and they had not seen each other for a long time. The man looked at the guy in shock, raising his eyebrows and opening his mouth. Kim Sajin turned to look at the man with the same shocked face. The guy stood up from the bench, looking questioningly at the man, and he asked what his eyes were on his back and how he dodged. Chiron showed a thumbs up with a smile, while the main character did not know what to say, and the boss loudly asked what they were doing here, and if they came to work, let them work. A man with gray hair looked down worriedly, asking Kim Sajin if he could handle it, and there was at least 200 kilograms, and you could overextend yourself. Kim Sajin turned to him with a smile, saying that there was nothing wrong and let him download. The guy walked with a smile while 3 huge pieces of monster meat were tied to his back. The boss and the man with gray hair looked at him in confusion. The man thought that he really seemed okay. The boss put his hand to his face and shouted that they would continue after the break. Kim Sajin clenched his hand into a fist while looking at him and thought that it was strange and he felt as if power was overflowing him. The guy sat down with his arms stretched forward, while there were 3 huge pieces of meat on his back, and thought that he could at least complete the daily task, and after work there would still be no time. The guy wiped his forehead, closed his eyes and exhaled, raising the phone to his face, saying that he needed to check if he was doing everything correctly. Kim Sajin's eyes widened and he opened his mouth wide, looking at the phone screen. Next to one of the tasks there was a +3 icon and the guy shouted that 1 squat counted as 3. A loading icon appeared above the guy, and he thought it was because the extra weight increased efficiency. The man with gray hair put his hand to his mouth, looked at him and shouted that he should rest. Kim Sajin smiled widely and blushed, thinking it was gorgeous. The man looked at him in confusion, standing behind him. The main character shouted to someone that he could help, and he would take more. The guy asked if it needed to be carried and he would handle it. The guy with a smile held 2 more pieces of monster meat under his armpits, walking forward and thinking, why take time to exercise if he can train while working? A man in a white t-shirt was worriedly stretching his hand towards the guy. Kim Sajin leaned his hands on the ground and said let's go, counting 36, 37 and doing push-ups. The guy thought that the more weight, the less to do, and it turns out that you can work and spend time profitably. Kim Sajin smiled broadly, saying that now he was doing pull-ups. The man in a white t-shirt raised his fist up and shouted, he's a fool or something and will overstrain himself. The main character was lying on the bed, raising his hands and with his eyes closed, muttering that he was going to die. The guy clutched the phone in his hand, smiled tiredly and thought that combining work and classes turned out to be very effective. But it was very difficult. Who would even think of training and carrying monsters? The guy remembered how he did pull-ups, push-ups and ran with pieces of monsters on his back, while the man in a white t-shirt looked at him in shock and thought that he should have seen Ajoshi's face. The guy got up from the bed, sat down on it and said that at least he did something. He was holding a phone in his hand, on which the system window was open, with the inscription daily tasks, and the points running 30 kilometers, 30 out of 30, 1,000 squats, 1,000 out of 1,000, 300 push-ups, 300 out of 300, 300 press, 300 out of 300, 150 pull-ups, 150 out of 150. The guy smiled, knitted his eyebrows, and said that he saved a lot of time. A blue system notification on which it was written, the daily task was completed and the numbers that the guy typed in the tasks marked in yellow. Kim Sajin sat on the floor and closed his eyes, saying that it was only 10, and he had already listened to both lectures. The blue system windows showed that the Chiron course lecture was completed by 9.1%. and the Siddhartha Gautama course lecture was completed by 2.5%. The guy said it was good that he got it done so quickly, but he felt like he was wasting his time. The guy clicked on his phone, which had a system window on it, and asked if it might be worth looking again. He put his hand to his chin and frowned, looking at the phone, saying that he might as well sign up for another course, and this idea was not a bad one. He opened the system window on the phone, where the free pass was written and scrolled through, thinking that he would select something else from the free one. Kim Sojin gasped. The message appeared on the phone. You will become much stronger and you will be able to lift a mountain with your own hands. Professor Xiang Yu. The guy looked down at the phone screen, asking about Xiang Yu, and asked if it was about the hegemonic king. Kim Sojin put his hand to his chin, thinking about the man on the horse, whose eyes glowed green and who was holding a long spear. The guy thought that the hegemonic king Xiang Yu, the legendary ruler of Western Chu, famous for his superhuman strength, and for good reason they say about him, 1 for 7 will go. The guy looked at the system window, on which it was written whether he wanted to enroll in this course, and upon completion he would receive a spear that lifts mountains, and a button to enroll. The guy thought that it sounded good, and also free. Someone asked if he wanted to learn the skill of the spear. The armored man with green shoulder pads and black hair laughed loudly, closing his eyes and saying that since he signed up for this course, he is just a loser who does not know the basics, and he is a non-entity who wants to wield a spear. The main character held the phone in both hands, casting a shadow on it and nodded absently. Xiang Yu smiled widely, holding a spear in his hand with green energy glowing around it. He squinted his red eyes. There was an inscription next to him. The hegemonic king of Western Chu Xiang Yu. The man said that he will teach him, and all the foolish ones can be free. And there is no need to listen to the monkey. Xiang Yu said to simply swing the spear, feel it with every cell of your body, understand it, and then return to it. 2 system windows appeared. On the first it was written that a daily task was received, and on the second it said that the task was being adapted to the current level of the student. Kim Sojin looked in confusion at the task that appeared on the phone screen. It was written there, perform 5,000 swings of the spear, 0 out of 5,000. The guy loudly asked what. He lowered his head, casting a shadow on the floor, and said that he had only said a couple of sentences and that was the whole lecture. Kim Sojin said that this was another task. He looked at the phone, on which it was written to perform 5,000 swings of a spear. Xiang Yu pointed his finger forward and laughed loudly, asking, he wants to learn the skill of a spearman. Let him just swing a spear. Kim Sojin sadly said why all the tasks are like this. The dark sky above the apartment buildings where the main character lived. A girl with a long sword on her hip and black hair turned back to the head of the monster transport, asking if there were any problems. He clasped his hands together and smiled broadly, saying that of course not, and they didn't have a single accident at work, all thanks to competent management and compliance with safety regulations, and there is absolutely nothing to worry about. A girl with brown eyes looked to the side. Next to her there was a sign, B-Class Hunter, Park CU. She said that they had heard about the giant who had awakened the other day, and of course she was personally convinced of his death, but she would still like conduct a thorough check in case they missed something. The man smiled widely, saying whatever she wished. Other workers in orange and blue uniforms looked at him. They looked at him, whispering that he was almost on his knees in front of the girl, and who she was. Behind them walked a guy with pieces of meat and the head of a killed manticore on his back. Kim Sojin's eyes widened and he frowned when someone said that she was the granddaughter of Star Sword and her name was Park Cu. The guy thought about Star Sword. A man in a dark suit, with gray hair and a beard. His eyes glowed with a blue light, and there was blue energy around him. He put his hand on a katana with a golden sheath and a silver handle. On top it was written, Park Min-chul, the Star Sword. 100 years ago, a bright blue portal from which various monsters stretched their paws, the heads of skeletons, dragons and other monsters were visible. He was one of the first awakened ones who received their power the moment the gate opened. A monster with green skin and one big eye opened its mouth, sticking out its tongue. A woman and a little girl turned behind the stone with frightened faces. Then they knew practically nothing about the awakened ones. The monsters were more cruel and could roam the streets unhindered. The woman closed her eyes and hugged the girl, pressing her to herself. She was not completely sure that humanity would be able to survive. A guy with black hair jumped in front of a woman with a child and swung his sword, the blow of which emitted bright white light and sparks of lightning, cutting the monster into 2 parts. The woman and the girl looked in surprise at the guy from whom a bright white light was coming. He looked forward, white sparks of lightning flying around him. At that time, Park Min-chul was one of the few awakened. The guy turned to the woman with the child, holding a sword in his hands, standing on the bloody stones. He was one of those who did not allow their civilization to disappear. The real savior of the world, a hero. Park Min-chul with gray hair had 2 hands on the hilt of his sword, casting a shadow on him. A lot of time has passed since then. He is already quite old, but he is still a heavyweight in his field, able to compete with anyone. Kim Sojin smiled, beads of sweat running down his face, and he closed his eyes. The guy, clenching his teeth, was dragging the head of a huge monster on his back, and 2 pieces of it under his armpits, shouting as if he cared. Park Si-yu looked at him worriedly from behind. The girl looked away at the guy and asked what he was doing. The boss frowned in confusion and said not to pay attention. And he had been like this for a week. He seemed to have gone crazy. Park Si-yu walked past, throwing her hair back, and thought that his head was going crazy or something, while the guy frowned and counted 45, 46. Ajoshi looked forward while the main character shouted that he would throw the corpses here and counted 60. The monster's huge clawed paw fell in front of the man and he muttered okay in confusion. He turned to Kim Sojin, who was on one knee, asking him when he should calm down. The guy said that since he started the course, he needed to find out how it would end, and counted out 61. A huge manticore with white fur on its head and a severed white horn next to it. The guy smiled, wiping his forehead, and said that these tasks really have a meaning. The man frowned, looking at him, and asked what other meaning. He sighed and said displeasedly that he would die so soon. And okay, he dragged him. Well done, let him get out of here. Kim Sojin smiled, closed his eyes, and said that he would bring more. Ajoshi sighed and smiled, closing his eyes as the dead monster lay behind him. Behind the man, the monster suddenly twitched weakly. Kim Sojin turned around sharply, looking to the side. The huge manticore flew into the air, wounds were visible on its body, and various pieces of flesh flew off nearby. A man in a white t-shirt covered his head with his hand, looking at her. Opening its mouth, the manticore growled, its eyes glowing yellow. The main character's eyes widened and he loudly called Ajoshi, frowning. Closing her eyes, Park Si-yu yawned and exhaled. The girl stood leaning on a pillar and crossed her arms over her chest, thought about the head of the factory, who folded his hands and said that the granddaughter of the Star Sword had no place in such a remote place, and they would better discuss everything in their cool office. The girl put out her hand, saying that everything was fine. The girl thought that she had finally escaped from there, and she clearly didn't like their boss. Park Si-yu wondered how long to endure all this. The man in the orange uniform turned to her, frowning. Park Si-yu opened her eyes when she heard the man say that this is the daughter of the Star Sword. 2 men stood next to each other. Behind the girl, one of them said that she would hear. The other said displeasedly that they were far from her, and what class she was. The girl closed her eyes and thought, she hears everything. The man loudly asked that she had a B class. She was the daughter of the Star Sword. The second one told him to be quieter. Park Si-yu crossed her arms over her chest, looking forward sadly, and thought that for many, the Star Sword is a hero, but for her, this name is a burden, a label that she cannot get rid of. From the cradle, her grandfather taught her to be a hunter. She remembered how she trained with a sword, lowering it, and thought that the bar he set was too high, and she simply could not overcome it. Park Si-yu clutched a wooden sword in her hand. There were a lot of bandages on her hands. The girl thought that all her life she had been compared to her hero grandfather, but her real dream was to teach people. Park Si-yu put her hand to her chest, standing behind Park Min-chul, shouting to him that she wants to become a teacher. The man displeasedly answered her that he didn't want to hear that. Without turning around, the man told her not to bring up this topic again, and Park Si-yu clenched her hand into a fist. She thought that because she was the granddaughter of Star Sword, she could not live a normal life. But they came to a compromise, and she founded a hunter academy. 2 guys, one of whom was in a white t-shirt, and the second in a black one. One of them said, "Is it really possible that the same Star Sword will teach them?" The second replied that this cannot be. Park Si-yu held a piece of paper in her hands, looking at it, and said that the Star Sword has nothing to do with it, and she will be the teacher. A guy in a white t-shirt walked past her, saying that it seems they were deceived. The girl thought that when they found out that it turned out that her grandfather did not teach at her academy. Park Si-yu looked forward, smiling, and asked for forgiveness. She looked after the students, clutching the papers to her, and thought that then they immediately lost interest and left. The girl clenched her hands on the sheets, thinking that they needed the Star Sword, not her. Park Si-yu lowered her hands. The sheets of paper in front of her scattered in different directions. She walked through the production site, where people were carrying pieces of the monster, thinking that even the few that remained had left the academy after her grandfather's threats, and now no one knew about her. Park Si-yu clenched her hand into a fist and frowned, closing her eyes, thinking if she had at least one worthy student. One of the workers with gray hair ran out from around the corner. The man frightenedly muttered to everyone to run. The other worker and the girl turned to look at him in surprise. The worker loudly shouted that there was a monster. Park Si-yu's eyes widened and her mouth fell open when she heard this. The manticore stood next to Ajoshi lying on the ground. growling, and the main character, looking at this, called the man. Kim Sojin clenched his teeth and frowned, wondering why the manticore suddenly came to life, and wasn't it killed. A man in a white t-shirt raised his head to the guy and frighteningly shouted at him to run. The man shouted for the guy to forget about him and save himself. Kim Sojin looked at the man in fear, clenched his hands into fists, and thought that he would be killed. The guy's eyes widened and he frowned, thinking that he would definitely be killed. An ordinary person will never defeat a monster, just like an awakened person who is unable to use magic. The silhouette of a creature with 4 legs, wings, and a scorpion tail, the manticore is a 4th-level monster that even a professional will have a hard time with. The main character asked if there were hunters here. He remembered a girl with long black hair, and thought that Park Siyu was just nearby. Kim Sojin leaned on the iron beams, stepped back, and thought that she had already left. She wouldn't make it in time and he would simply be bitten to death. A huge manticore stood next to Ajoshi, who looked at it in fear. The main character thought that he needed to act right now. Someone must urgently do something, otherwise he could not be saved. The manticore opened its mouth and licked itself with its long tongue. Kim Sojin was trembling, looking at her, sweat running down his face. He thought, but who should do this? Opening its mouth wide, the manticore roared loudly. The main character grabbed the iron beam in his hand. He threw back the wooden backpack that he carried on his back in order to carry the corpses of monsters. Screaming loudly, Kim Sojin grabbed the iron beam with both hands with an angry face. The guy swings the iron beam towards the manticore, driving it away from Ajoshi, who looks at the guy in surprise. Kim Sojin turns to the man and yells at him to run faster, holding the beam in front of him. The man gets up and, frowning at the guy, asks how he is. Kim Sojin, frowning, shouts that they will both be devoured and let him leave faster. The guy clenches his teeth, clutches the beam in his hands and trembles, thinking that now only he is left, and he needs to hold out until the hunters arrive. Kim Sojin stood in front of the silhouette of a huge manticore, with white eyes and a scar on one eye. The guy looked at the manticore with a frightened look. A shadow fell on his head. Mentally, the main character told himself not to be afraid, to control himself and not to hesitate, not to stand like a pillar. Kim Sojin frowned. His face was illuminated by a greenish light. Someone's voice said that he was the universe, that he must observe the world, know its origins. Kim Sojin stood in the middle of the lake. Nearby there were green leaves of trees that were in the air. A voice told him to know the origins of the world. Kim Sojin remembered that Buddha said so. The manticore looked at the guy, opening its mouth, standing in front of him. Buddha said that you need to embrace the universe. Think about where it is going. Buddha stood behind the main character, with his eyes closed and his hands clasped together. Kim Sojin thought that he should put aside his emotions. The manticore rested her paw on the ground, which broke beneath her. The manticore opens its mouth, growling and approaching the main character, who stands in front of it, holding the iron beam away from him, thinking that then his wildly beating heart will calm down on its own. The guy runs towards the manticore with a calm expression on his face. The manticore also pushes off the ground, running towards the guy. Standing in front of the guy, the manticore waved its paw, moving it back, its yellow eyes glowing brightly. The guy's eyes glowed green as he remembered Chiron, who told him not to think, but to move, otherwise it might be too late and he would have to trust his instincts. The guy dodged the manticore's paw, which waved next to his face. She hit the ground, but Kim Sojin jumped to the side, turning over and standing on his feet away from the monster. The manticore swung her scorpion tail in the air. Kim Sojin leaned his iron stick on the ground, jumped up and mentally told himself not to think. The manticore hit the ground again where the guy who had flown above her had previously stood and mentally told himself to rely on his feelings. The manticore shakes its head when it loses sight of the protagonist. Kim Sojin flies over the head of the manticore, realizing that he has entered its blind spot. The guy looks down at her, realizing that it's time to attack, but mentally wonders what he should do. He looks down. Zhang Yu stands behind him with his arms crossed, saying that strength alone is not enough to lift a mountain. The man next to the guy smiled widely, saying that he needed courage and zeal. He needed to trust them, and believe that he was capable of cutting the mountain in half, and not even dare to doubt himself. The guy's hands are squeezing the metal beam he was holding in his hands. A blue light emanates from the protagonist's eyes as he mentally tells himself that he can cut her apart. The guy looks at the manticore, which is standing on the ground, and thinks that he simply has to do this. The manticore raises its head, looking to the side. Zhang Yu speaks of a force that can move a mountain. The manticore opens its mouth, growling, its yellow eyes glowing. Zhang Yu speaks of the power that is capable of tearing a mountain out of the ground. Kim Sojin waves the stick he is holding in his hands. It glows blue in his hands, and blue lightning emanates from it. His eyes turn white. A beam of blue light recognizes the manticore, which opens its mouth wide, and the beam of light cuts it in half. A large explosion occurred in the place where the manticore stood, dust rising into the air. Park Se-yu ran among other workers who looked in that direction in shock. The girl loudly asked what was happening there and what the explosion was. Park Se-yu looked ahead, a cloud of dust flying next to her. The main character stood in a cloud of dust, wearing orange and blue work clothes, clutching an iron beam in his hand. The guy stood in front of the manticore's body, which was cut into two parts. Park Se-yu and other workers stood in front of him. The main character silently looked down with a calm expression on his face. The guy's eyes suddenly widened in surprise, as if he had woken up, and his mouth opened slightly. He smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, saying that it really worked. The system window showed Chiron lecture progress plus 10%, 21.5%. Buddha lecture progress plus 2.6%, 5.1%. Xiang Yu lecture progress plus 13%, 19.7%. Park Se-yu looked ahead in surprise, her hair fluttering in the wind as she wondered what happened here. Kim Sojin awkwardly scratched the back of his head, smiling and standing with one foot on the dead manticore. The girl thought that some loader who didn't even study at the academy, with a beam instead of a normal weapon, had dealt with such a monster. Suddenly, Kim Sojin looked to the side, noticing something. The guy walked past the girl, who was looking ahead in surprise, and called Ajoshi. Park Se-yu turned back, where the main character approached a man in a white t-shirt, asking if the man was okay. He answered yes and asked how Kim Sojin was. Kim Sojin said that the man himself knows how much he has been training lately and he still needs to go to the hospital just in case. Park Se-yu turned to the guy while the factory manager was next to her, folding his arms and smiling, saying that we checked the manticore, but it looks like we were a little mistaken. Ajoshi hugged the main character with a wide smile, holding his head between his hands. Other workers also stood nearby, smiling and praising the guy while he smiled awkwardly, asking Ajoshi to go to the hospital first. Park Se-yu looked at Kim Sojin in surprise, saying that here he is. The girl thought that this was her worthy student. The head of the factory raised his hand up in displeasure, frowning and saying that no one should talk about what happened today. Other workers were walking along the road. Someone said that they had done a good job and it was time to go home. Ajoshi waved to Kim Sojin, who waved back to the man and asked him to definitely stop by the doctor. Ajoshi sighed and closed his eyes, saying okay, the guy is tired of this already. Kim Sojin picked up his phone and looked at it. There was a blue system window on the phone that said, Chiron lecture progress plus 10%, total 21.5%. Buddha lecture progress plus 2.6%, total 5.1%. Xiang Yu lecture progress plus 13%, total 19.7%. The guy said that this is progress today, and when he listened to the lectures, he had never seen such figures. Kim Sojin put his hand to his face, remembering his battle with the manticore, and said that apparently everything was because he defeated the manticore, and it is better to see once than to hear 1,000 times. The guy frowned, thinking that practice was the best way to improve progress in lectures. Kim Sojin thought about the white card, thinking that in order to get at least a temporary license, you need to enter the Hunter Academy, and without it you can't get into the dungeon. He walked along the road, scratching the back of his head, and thought that the Transcendent Academy could not issue him a license. The guy said that he needed to save up for education again. Park Se-yu walked behind him. The girl called the guy, approaching him from behind, and he turned to the girl. Park Se-yu put her hand to her chest, frowned, and asked the guy for a few words. He frowned at her, thinking that she was the huntress who collaborated with their company and seemed to be the granddaughter of the Star Sword. Kim Sojin turned to the girl and thought about what she wanted. He told her, of course, and he was listening. Park Se-yu raised her hand and said that she would get straight to the point. Frowning, the girl screamed, scaring a passerby who was walking by, wondering if the guy wanted to meet her grandfather. Kim Sojin looked at her displeasantly, saying that he didn't want to. Above him there was an inscription, indifferent. The girl closed her eyes and put her hand to her chin, saying that she had no doubt that he wanted, but then turned to the guy in shock, loudly asking what. Kim Sojin waved his hand at her and walked further down the road, saying that he had gone. The girl screamed loudly for him to wait. Kim Sojin scratched his ear and thought that he would go home and listen to lectures. The silhouettes of houses in the city could be seen behind which the sun was setting. The girl's name is Park Se-yu. She is 31 years old. She stood frowning, with white eyes, thinking that in her entire life she had never seen anything like this, and she just didn't know what to do. Kim Sojin stood in front of her, frowning and asking, so she is inviting him to enter her academy, where there is not a single student, and in fact they are only an academy on paper. The girl thought who he even was. Park Si-yu thought that he was doing some strange exercises, remembering how a guy with clenched teeth was dragging pieces of manticore meat on his back and under his armpits. She remembered how the guy stood in front of the dead, cut manticore, thinking that even if the manticore was greatly weakened, it was still a 4th level monster, and he cut it in 2. Park Si-yu realized that the guy definitely wants to become a hunter. The girl put her hand to her chest, waving her other hand, and said that they have everything he needs. Good equipment, and the rest is also enough. Only there are no teachers, but she can be him. Kim Sojin closed his eyes, walking along the road, and said that he does not want and does not need any teachers. The girl clenched her teeth and her hair covered her eyes. She clenched her hands into fists, looking after the departing guy, and said that if she persuades her grandfather to take him as a student, Kim Sojin, without turning to the girl, said that he was not interested. Park Si-yu thought that all hunters dream of learning from the Star Sword, and will he really miss this opportunity? She thought that she wouldn't let the main character go so easily. She again shouted after the guy that the exam had a written part, and asked how he was going to pass it. Kim Sojin shrugged and said that he would manage somehow. The girl followed him along the road, asking what about the dungeons, and even now send him on a raid. But for this he must be a student at the academy. Now he is just wasting his time. Kim Sojin frowned, saying that only government-approved academies have the right to issue licenses. Park Si-yu raised her hand up, frowning and shouting that, in fact, they had already been approved, and if he agreed, he could go to the dungeon tomorrow. Kim Sojin didn't look at the girl when he heard this. She looked at him in surprise, realizing that he had slowed down and could not retreat. The girl shouted that if he did not need teachers, she would not interfere, and would provide him with a place for independent training. The girl closed her eyes and clenched her hand into a fist, shouting that she would not take a penny from him. Kim Sojin stopped. Kim Sojin turned to the girl, putting his hand in his pants pockets, and asked what, that is, he just needs to do. But free cheese only comes in a mousetrap, and what does she need from him? Putting her hand to her chest, Park Si-yu, looking at the guy, said that until he becomes a hunter, he will represent her academy in competitions, and he should also tell everyone that he is studying at her academy. The guy looked at the girl with a calm face, thinking that this was an extremely advantageous offer, and in this way he would solve all his problems at once, while practically nothing was required from him. He asked the girl why him. Park Si-yu looked at the guy with a frown, saying that she saw potential in him. The girl smiled slightly, looking at the guy with a determined expression on her face, her hair ruffled by the wind. Kim Sojin also smiled while looking at her and thought it was good. Holding out his hand to the girl and telling her his name, the main character thought that this would be a mutually beneficial relationship. The girl smiled wider and shook the main character's hand, telling him her name. Kim Sojin thought that at some point this relationship would run its course. The next day, the phone in the protagonist's hand vibrated. Kim Sojin put it to his ear, standing in front of a white building, and asked Mr. Man-chol. The man on the phone asked Kim Sojin what he had done, and the boss was fired. The guy remembered yesterday when Park Si-yu bowed before him, asking for forgiveness, and said that because of her carelessness he almost got hurt. Thanking the guy for coping with the manticore, he scratched the back of his head and asked if he could to ask for something. Kim Sojin smiled widely. Red horns were visible on his head. When he asked the girl to tell their company that because she did not like their boss, she would not cooperate, the guy closed his eyes, holding the phone to his ear. Remembering this, thinking that he didn't think that the boss would be fired right away, he replied that he had nothing to do with it, and most likely the boss himself left so as not to be responsible for yesterday. The guy walked along the road with a yellow dotted line, while the man on the phone said that the boss couldn't quit because of this. But the main thing was that he was no longer here, and everyone seemed happy. The man on the phone asked if the guy was going to the Hunter Academy. Kim Sojin stopped in front of a light building on which was written Dream Hunter Academy. Park Si-yu waved at him, saying that she was here. The girl handed the guy a white card, saying that this was his temporary license. The main character took it in his hands, thanking the girl, and she crossed her arms over her chest, saying that she was acting from today. The guy thought that he doubted, but she really settled everything. He held in his hand a white card on which it was written, Temporary Hunter's License, Serial Number K220512, Class D, Name Kim Sojin. The guy thought that although he had not yet become a professional hunter, he had already taken the first step towards your dream. Smiling, the guy squeezed the license in his hand, thinking that this was just the beginning. He asked Park Si-yu to tell him how to go on raids. The girl turned her back to him and smiled, closing her eyes and saying that there was no need for this. The guy asked what it meant. Park Si-yu pointed to a black stand with various spears, saying that she had prepared weapons for him and let him choose what he likes, and as he chooses, they will go to the dungeon. The girl looked sideways at the guy and smiled at him. She said that she had already signed the contract and thought that the guy wouldn't mind. A huge blue portal, next to which there was a yellow fence with the inscription "Keep Out." A stick landed on a huge mouse with red eyes. Kim Sojin walked through the dungeon, holding his spear behind his back, and turned to Park Si-yu behind him, saying that she said that she would not interfere. And why did she follow him? The girl folded her hands behind her back and smiled, saying that he was the only one student at the academy, and how she could leave him unattended. Knitting her eyebrows, the girl raised her finger and said that he should consider that he has an individual task, and such an opportunity is given only to the most capable students. Kim Sojin with a smile threw his spear over his shoulder and said that he would consider it an honor. They walked through the dungeon past a dead huge rat, and the girl said that it was his first time in the dungeon, and now she is his lifeline, although only kobolds live here. Let him not let his guard down. The guy thought that kobolds are second-level monsters that ideal for training beginners without combat experience. Kim Sojin clenched his hand into a fist and looked back at the dead monster, thinking that fortunately he could easily penetrate their magical armor, just like in the battle with the manticore. The protagonist's eyes glowed with a bright blue light, and there was blue energy nearby as he thought that attacks not imbued with mana should simply bounce off their defenses. The girl shouted at him to be careful, and Kim Sojin suddenly sat down when a kobold flew over him, trying to hit him. He thought it was somehow strange. The kobold looked back over his shoulder in fear. Kim Sojin waved his hand, frowning and raising his spear behind his back. He hit the kobold in front of him harshly on the chest, his eyes glowing blue as he thought about why his attacks were so effective. 3 system windows appeared on which it was written, Chiron Lecture Progress plus 0.6% only 22.5%. Xiang Yu Lecture Progress plus 0.4 only 20.1%. Buddha Lecture Progress plus 0% only 5.1%. The guy looked at his phone with a wide smile, and said that he was growing little by little. Park Si-yu looked at him in confusion. Kim Sojin thought that this was certainly not as fast as killing a manticore, but it was good progress for 2 kobolds, and it was definitely worth it. Park Si-yu, with a surprised face, put her hand on the handle of her katana, pulling it out of its sheath. The guy thought that besides, you can make good money in the dungeons. Kim Sojin turned to the girl with a smile and closed eyes and told her that it was time to speed up. The main character thought it was like he was farming experience in a video game. The guy ran with a spear at 3 kobolds, smiling widely. One of them jumped up at the guy, 2 more looked at him. Their eyes glowed red. Park Si-yu thought that she immediately thought that there was something wrong with the main character. The guy was sitting on the floor, holding the phone in his hands and saying that he needed to continue to stay away from the Hydra poison. The girl stood behind him, looking at him incomprehensibly, and thought what he was doing. She was scared, and this was too much. The girl frowned, remembering Kim Sojin, who was holding a phone with a black screen in front of him. His eyes turned white and he asked if she didn't see anything. Next there was an inscription of how Kim Sojin looks from the side. The girl thought that since they returned from dungeons, he constantly looks at the switched-off phone, and for how many hours he has been sitting like that. Park Si-yu stood silently behind the guy, who looked at the phone and asked how he did it. She thought that the worst thing was that the strangeness was just beginning. She remembered how Kim Sojin dodged and killed the kobold, thinking that a newbie who was in the dungeon for the first time was cutting down kobolds like a trained professional. She remembered how the guy with a wide smile took 2 kobolds under the armpits, squatted on one knee, and said that since Park Si-yu had nothing to do, let him help him a little. After all, what kind of money? The girl held the dead kobold in her arms, looking at the guy with a confused expression face, thinking that he was constantly doing some strange exercises with killed monsters. Rather than carrying them himself, it would have been better for him to call a special service, but he decided to save money. The girl behind the guy put her hands to her head, thinking that she couldn't hide from her grandfather forever, that she had a student and she couldn't stand it anymore. Suddenly the main character screamed loudly. Kim Sojin frowned, shouting that it was already midnight and he hadn't listened to the lecture. Park Si-yu smiled tiredly, closing her eyes, beads of sweat running down her face as she mentally asked what kind of lecture. She wondered if she had definitely made the right choice. Kim Sojin smiled. His face turned red and he closed his eyes. The page with the main character's bank, where the amount was 9,510,000. He shouted that he could not imagine that he could earn so much in a day. Kim Sojin scratched his nose, remembering how he butchered the monsters yesterday while Park Si-yu looked at him in fear, and said that yesterday he carried and butchered the carcasses himself, so it was not easy. But all his efforts paid off. The guy opened his eyes, raised his hand to his face and said that the problem is that all this takes too much time and effort. And he didn't even have time to listen to the lectures. He stood in front of the crosswalk, thinking that he could ask the Manchul master to work together, and he would trust him. Besides, they could stay in touch, and if he opened his own business, everyone would benefit. The traffic light turned green for pedestrians and the guy thought he would write to him when he had time. Kim Sojin looked to the side and adjusted his bag on his shoulder, thinking about what to do with the money. And of course he can start saving again. But he thinks it's better to spend it well. The main character remembered how he stuck a spear into the kobold, putting one foot on him and looking at the phone, thinking that by clearing the dungeon he was earning money and increasing his progress in lectures. But everything was going slower than he expected and they didn't give anything at all for the last kobold. Kim Sojin remembered watching Sun Wukong's lesson and how he held a stick that glowed blue at the end. The guy thought if there was a quick way to become stronger, and become as strong as the great celestial sage Sun Wukong. The guy stood with his back turned, holding a bag on his shoulder and casting a long shadow on the ground. Kim Sojin's eyes suddenly widened and he blushed and shouted about Sun Wukong, scaring a passerby who was walking by. The guy thought he saw a piece of his lecture, and before he had no money so he forgot about it, but now he can afford it. 2 system windows, on the first it was written, the basics of fighting with a staff, and a spear, dispelling, capturing, piercing, Professor, Great Celestial Sage. On the second it was written whether the student would like to enroll in the course. Upon completion he will receive the class Great Sage Spearman S depending into the phone. The main character smiled widely and blushed, looking at the phone, thinking let's go. The system window showed that the entry fee was 27 billion won. The guy looked at the phone in confusion, looking at it and tilted his head questioningly. On the city street, the cry of the main character was heard, who shouted 27 billion. Kim Sojin sat on the ground with his head down while people passed by him and looked at him in confusion. The guy muttered that this was some kind of transcendental amount, and even an S-class hunter could not earn that much. The guy looked at his phone, saying that there was nothing to do and somehow later, anyway, there was no time now, and asked if anything else was for sale at the academy. A fire was burning around the main character when he said that since there was no money for the lecture, maybe he could buy equipment. A man walked past him who thought that the guy was some kind of crazy. Another also looked at him in confusion, telling him not to look him in the eyes. Kim Sojin shouted that this is it. It was written on the blue window, Transcendental Store, training equipment made by their students. The guy looked at the phone screen in shock, raising his eyebrows and muttering that he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of the phone screen was a red sword with a red stone on the hilt, a black shield with a large purple stone in the middle, a black spear with a white blade, and a blue elixir. The main character said it was an elixir. The Aegis shield, even the spear of Longinus. Kim Sojin put his hand on his head, looking at the screen in confusion and shouted that even if these are all replicas, these are legendary things and they call this training equipment. Sitting on the ground, the guy looked at the screen in shock, thinking that even he, the one who does not understand weapons, understands that this is something incredible, and the equipment made by the students of the academy means it was done by transcendence. The guy smiled widely and blushed, raising his finger to the phone screen. He thought that he didn't think that it was so easy to get a legendary weapon. The main character said that he would see what could be useful to him. On the blue system window there was a photograph of a spear with a white blade and a blue stone in the middle. Next to it it was written, the spear of Longinus, a replica. The spear that Longinus thrust into the hypochondrium of the crucified Jesus Christ. The main character clicked on the buy button next to it, thinking that this was the spear of Longinus and he was needed by. The system window showed that individual costs were being calculated. The system window showed the spear of Longinus, but the amount was not loaded. The white building of the academy for hunters is a couple. Someone was loudly counting down. 68, 69, 70. Park Si-yu looked forward in confusion, holding sheets of paper, looking forward while the guy continued to count down 71, 72. The main character was doing push-ups. Flames were burning around him. The girl said that today he is training even harder and has something happened. The guy continued to count down loudly, thinking that he knew that the spear would be expensive, and he assumed that it could cost several million, and he was aware of the risk he was taking. Drops of sweat flowed down the protagonist's face when he frowned and screamed, remembering the system window on which the amount was written. 100 million. The guy loudly mentally asked if he was blind. And 100 million, where would he get so much money? He also cannot be resold. The guy looked at the phone, saying that he could just take out a loan and then sell the spear for more. On the system window it was written, only students have the right to use items created by their predecessors. Resale is strictly prohibited. The guy was upset and realized that it was impossible. Standing up, Kim Sojin sadly lowered his head, saying that again everything comes down to money. And even 100 million is already expensive. He can't even imagine whether he will ever save 27 billion to listen to the lectures of the great sage. Park Se-yu awkwardly smiled at him and extended her hand, asking if he has a minute. The guy looked at the girl in surprise, raising his eyebrows, and asked about the academy tournament. She smiled with her eyes closed and asked, he had heard about it. Kim Sojin said that he heard, but did not know the details, smiling widely. Park Se-yu raised her hand and said that from the name it is clear that academies compete on it. Each academy wants to prove that it is better than the rest. She handed a piece of paper to the main character, saying that this tournament evaluates the level of the academy. On the sheet was written a 4th level tournament position. Park Se-yu said that such which competitions are versatile. Now their academy is on the 4th level, the pyramid, which is divided into 4 pieces from the 1st to the 4th level. The girl said that if he performs well, he will move on to the next one. A huge bear, which opened its mouth wide, standing over the people. Another warrior cut the monster into 2 parts. A guy surrounded by purple energy ran forward clenching his fists. A guy surrounded by yellow energy turned back at him. Another guy, around whom there was red energy, extended his hand and raised his sword behind his back. Park Se-yu raised her index finger, looking at the main character, and said that the higher the level, the better the academy is considered and the more support it receives from the state. So everyone sends their best students. Kim Sojin held sheets of paper in his hands and asked why she gave him everything explains. Park Se-yu grinned at him and said that he had already guessed. She smiled widely, extended her hand to the guy and said that she wanted him to represent their academy. Kim Sojin looked at her seriously, wondering if participating in the competition would affect his progress in lectures. Smiling broadly, the guy nodded and thought that if you think about it, the tournament is also practice. He replied that it sounds good and he agrees. The guy walked forward and the girl asked in surprise if it was true. Putting her hand to her chest, the main character turned to her and said that they had initially agreed on this and asked how the tournaments were going. Park Se-yu put her hand to her chin, saying that everything will be kept secret until the start of the competition. But as far as she knows, the one who scores more points for the raid and duel wins. Kim Sojin took a spear from the stand, saying what the raid and duel means. The guy looked forward, a bead of sweat running down his face as he thought that, come to think of it, all of his combat experience was limited to kobolds and manticores, and he had no idea how to fight humans. Kim Sojin closed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest, holding a spear in his hand, thinking what to do, and since he decided to participate, he needs to give it his all. And will anyone agree to train with him? The girl looked at him questioningly over her shoulder. Kim Sojin turned to the girl with a surprised look as she looked at him. Kim Sojin asked her if she would be his sparring partner. Park Se-yu loudly asked what. The girl closed her eyes and frowned, holding a wooden sword in her hand. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about the main character in the form of a pink animal, who looked at her with his head bowed and asked if she wanted to fight with him and was she really chickening out. Kim Sojin next to him covered his mouth, laughing. The guy smiled, looking decisively at the girl and thought that this was a great opportunity. He thought that Park Se-yu was a B-class hunter, and although B-class was far from the top, she was taught by the Star Sword itself. Park Se-yu stood with a wooden sword in front of her. Behind her stood the figure of a man, around whom bright blue energy shone. Kim Sojin thought that of course, he was still a beginner, and it was not for him to judge real hunters. The guy raised his hand to his face and, blushing, turned away, closing his eyes, thinking that he was so happy and he had long wanted to know what she was capable of. Park Se-yu looked at him, worriedly asking if he was serious. The girl looked at the smiling guy, saying that he knew that she was a B-class hunter. Kim Sojin lowered his head with a smile and answered, of course. He took a fighting stance, holding a spear in his hand and smiling, asked her to give him a head start. They stood opposite each other and Park Si-yu sighed, closing her eyes and holding her sword in front of her, telling him to start an attack as soon as he was ready. There was a flash of movement. Kim Sojin ran towards the girl with a spear in his hands, holding it with both hands, and shouted that such an offer would not be refused. Park Si-yu tilted her head looking at him and thought, of course. The spear flew towards the girl. She sharply dodged to the side, holding the sword in front of her, and the main character hit the air in surprise. Park Si-yu thought it was a shame. Rapid movements were visible on the ground and the girl thought that the movements were fast, but extremely careless. Kim Sojin hit the girl again and she dodged, closing one eye, thinking that his attacks were easy to read. She remembered the guy who sharply dodged the kobold. The girl sadly lowered her head, thinking that she probably overestimated him and that he was a beginner. Park Si-yu raised her hand up, blue energy gathering around the wooden sword, and she thought that she didn't know where she got the confidence that he could fight her. The girl held the sword in two hands, raising it above her head. The guy stood in front of her. She thought, now she will finish with him. The sword sank down sharply, leaving behind a bright beam of blue energy. Park Si-yu's eyes widened in surprise. She held the sword in front of her, trying to hit the main character, but he put his spear in front of him, blocking her blow, dust flying around. The main character clenched his teeth, his body trembling as he tried to hold Park Si-yu's sword, saying how hard it was. Park Si-yu looked at the guy in surprise, pressing her sword on the spear, and thought how he managed to block the blow with magic. The girl looked in front of her in surprise while the protagonist's spear flew from the side into her face, thinking that the weapon should have jumped out of his hands. Park Si-yu blocked the guy's blow with her sword with a surprised face, thinking that her sword should have been right at his throat. Park Si-yu swung her sword and the main character jumped back, kneeling on one knee and lowering her head. The girl thought that it was supposed to be like this. She stood in front of the guy, lowering his sword. He put his hand to his face. Kim Sojin wiped his face with a smile and knitted his eyebrows. He brought the spear behind his back, blood running down his lip as he said with a wide smile that he too would fight in earnest. Many blue rays of light. Park Si-yu put her sword in front of her, blocking the blows. Thinking that his movements had changed, the attacks became clearer and faster. Kim Sojin stood with a serious face, looking forward. There was a blue beam of light in front of him and the girl thought that this could not be compared with what it was. Blue water, air bubbles were flying next to the main character, and his eyes were glowing with a blue light when Chiron's voice told him to start with obvious attacks. The guy swung his spear, causing Park Si-yu to lose her balance. White rays of light emanated from many swings of the spear. Xiang Yu's voice said that they need to be diluted with feints, in other words, distracting blows. He displeasedly asked who asked him to make obvious attacks and obvious feints, and if his opponent is able to assess the situation, he will change tactics. He needs not to be a fool, not to think that the enemy will stand like a pillar and expose himself to his blows. Kim Sojin struck multiple times with his spear, swinging it quickly while the girl blocked them with her sword, his eyes glowing blue. Park Si-yu held the sword in one hand, frowning at the guy, and blocking his blow. Xiang Yu's voice said that in response to obvious attacks, obvious blocks would follow. He said that when his blow was deflected by spinning, he should pull the spear back. After striking the girl, Kim Sojin turned around and spun the spear in the air. Park Si-yu looked at the guy in surprise as he pulled his sword back, and Xiang Yu told the guy to repeat this until the opponent opened up for his real attack. Park Si-yu gasped, jumping back when the guy jumped towards her. Xiang Yu said that when the enemy opens, you need to put all your strength into the blow. The main character raised the spear back, holding it in two hands. The guy's eyes were wide open and glowing blue when he thought it was time. Park Si-yu's eyes reflected the main character, and she thought it was dangerous. A powerful and bright beam of light passed across the ground from the guy's blow, which threw the stones around to the sides, breaking them. Park Si-yu swung her sword with a blue light coming from it. There was a cloud of dust around her when she thought what it was. The girl looked in fear at the guy who was lying against the wall, a stream of blood flowing from his mouth, and the wall behind was broken. The girl worriedly thought about what she had done, and hit with all her might, without even thinking. She quickly ran towards Kim Sojin, asking how he was. The guy exhaustedly muttered that he was fine. Kim Sojin smiled widely and, closing his eyes, awkwardly scratched the back of his head. Standing up, he said that in the end he lost. Dusting off his clothes, the girl thought that in the end. She looked at the guy in shock, her mouth wide open, and wondered if he really thought he could win, although he understood that he was fighting a B-class hunter. She turned away, confused about how to react to this. Kim Sojin looked questioningly at the girl, scratched the back of his head and thought that the hunter is still a hunter. It won't work to fight like a monster. A notification came to his phone and the guy looked down, thinking what the difference is between him and a professional hunter, and he still has everything ahead. Kim Sojin picked up the phone, on which a blue system window appeared, on which it was written, Chiron lecture progress plus 0.2%, total 26.7%. Buddha lecture progress plus 0%, total 5.1%. Zhang Yu lecture progress plus 0.7%, a total of 19.7%. The guy thought it had increased as expected. The main character shook his head, looking at the phone and the girl, thinking what it means to develop in different directions, and in video games everything is not like that. He told Park Si-yu that as far as he understands, she is free before the tournament. The girl pointed to herself and said in confusion, that seems to be the case. The guy asked if they could still train when there were no raids. The girl asked in surprise about training. Kim Sojin smiled widely, closing his eyes, and said that it would be useful for him and she would help him once. Park Si-yu blushed and thought that he had suffered a lot, and he wanted to continue fighting with her. The girl thought, who cares about his oddities, the main thing is that he is trying. She answered the guy that there is no problem. Park Si-yu smiled widely, looking at the guy, and clenched her hand into a fist, thinking that she promised that she would study with him every evening. The girl told the guy that she would do whatever he asked, and if he won, she would give all the prize money. The main character looked questioningly at the girl, standing opposite her, and asked that there was also prize money. She answered, of course, this is a tournament. Park Si-yu put her hand to her chin and looked away, remembering how much money there was. The girl said that it was about $100,000. Kim Sojin looked at her in shock, turning pale. On top of him was a black spear, on which hung a piece of paper, Longinus spear of $100,000. Kim Sojin leaned over, fire burning around him. When he asked when the tournament was, Park Si-yu looked at him with an awkward smile, raising her hand and wondering what was wrong with him, asking, he was talking about the date. She replied that there were still 2 weeks left. A flame burned in the eyes of the main character, and he opened his mouth wide, mentally asking for 2 weeks. The guy shouted loudly whether there are sandbags. Or is it better if he breaks this thing off, and something heavier is needed, otherwise it won't be as effective? Park Si-yu put her hands to her head, her hair fluttering as she confusedly asked about breaking it off, effectiveness, and what is he talking about? Kim Sojin knelt down on one knee with a huge piece of concrete, counting one, and the girl looked at him in shock and concern, asking what he was doing. Park Si-yu said it doesn't matter and the sandbags are in the corner, let him use them. The main character gasped and thanked the girl loudly. Counting 2, Park Si-yu closed her eyes as beads of sweat ran down her face and closed her eyes, thinking that she did not understand. Flames burned around Kim Sojin as he shouted that the $100,000 would go to him. 2 weeks later, the day of the tournament, people were walking along the street. Someone said that he hoped that there would be at least someone worthy. Another answered him that a guy was participating from last year. A guy in a green checkered shirt looked at the crowd and the building, saying that this is where the tournament is taking place. A guy with dark hair and round glasses held a bag on his shoulder, saying that he had finally arrived. He looked around. A crowd of people was passing behind him, worriedly saying that he didn't think there would be such a crowd, and of course, if there is something to see, then there will be spectators. The guy put his hand to his chin, looking at the crowd, and said that although there were much more awakened people, it's not often possible to see battles between hunters, and besides, where without recruiters from guilds and mercenaries, and their government, there are probably other people in front of the guy with dissatisfied faces. They thought that he was a bore. What was wrong with him, and is it necessary to explain everything when no one asks? The guy thought that he was in a hurry. He approached a man in a white shirt and with a red ribbon, saying that he was participating in the tournament and asking where the waiting room was. The man pointed to the side and said that he should go there. Waiting room for participants, white door with waiting room written on it. The guy in the green shirt nervously clutched the strap of his bag in his hands and thought about what to do. He stood trembling in the doorway, looking at the many tall and strong participants, some of whom were wearing armor or weapons, thinking that he was so nervous because he came alone, and was also so scared that he could not move. The guy looked at the participants, a man in a turtleneck with straps around his hips and a sword on the back, a man in a camouflage t-shirt with a helmet on his head, other men who were smiling. The guy thought that this was equipment, well, muscles, everyone seemed confident. He thought that everyone was so strong, but this is not surprising, because the academy sends the best students. The guy with glasses noticed between 2 muscular participants at the main character, who was sitting on a bench looking at the phone. A black arrow was pointing at him. Kim Sojin sat in a white t-shirt and black pants, looking at the phone. A blue jacket was tied around his body. The arrow pointed to his spear, with the inscription "Old Weapon," and on the jacket around his body, the inscription was a bag for a spear made of clothes. The guy in the green shirt adjusted his glasses in confusion. The other participants whispered behind him with a smile, asking what academy he was from and probably from some outback, trying to make themselves known. They continued to whisper that he was probably forced to participate. But why did he even choose such an academy? And even his phone was turned off. Kim Sojin with a dissatisfied face thought that he heard everything, but would not pay attention. He needed to watch the lecture. The guy in the green shirt raised his hands to his chest in confusion, while the students behind him whispered why the main character had come such a way, and what he was even going to do. The other laughed and replied that he would pack his things and return home. The guy in glasses with tears in his eyes put his hand to his face and thought that he was obviously his brother. Just like when you come to a new class where you don't know anyone and try to pretend to be busy by looking at your phone. Just like him, the guy remembered as he sat at his desk while a group of 3 people stood nearby. He trembled, thinking that he needed to pretend that he was not alone and write to a friend. Kim Sojin blushed, scratched his head awkwardly, saying that he wanted to participate in the tournament, but was so worried. There is no one to even talk to here and he will look at the phone. The guy with glasses realized that he was also completely alone here. Next to him there was a red inscription about what Kim Sojin looks like to a guy. Kim Sojin rubbed his ear, wondering what this guy was doing and feeling like he had misunderstood something. The guy with glasses with tears in his eyes put his hands to his face, thinking that he understood the guy so well. The camaraderie grew stronger, and Kim Sojin even do not know. The guy said hi to Kim Sojin and he looked up. He looked at the guy in a green shirt and round glasses, who smiled awkwardly, scratched the back of his head and said, "The main character is also participating in the tournament, and so is he. He is Lee Min-gi." The sign next to him showed, "Lee Min-gi is 19 years old, awakened from birth." The main character replied that yes, he is Kim Sojin. The guy thought that he was young and apparently high school students were also participating. Lee Min-gi asked to sit next to him and the guy agreed. Aside from them, one of the participants angrily shouted to someone that he had gotten something wrong. One of the members wearing a helmet and with a huge axe behind his back walked up to a guy in a black turtleneck. Lee Min-gi pointed at him and said that this is Chan Dak-chol, a promising student at Gachuri Academy. He fights with an axe and relies on everything strength. Chan Dak-chol stood in a camouflage t-shirt and helmet, shouting angrily that if they tell him to get out, then let him get out. The sign showed, Chan Dak-chol is a student at Gachuri Academy. A guy with long hair that was tied up in a bun and a scar on his eye looked at him angrily, saying that he listened to him, and he started it. His brain swam with muscles. The sign showed Lee Chol-min is a student at Mint Academy. Lee Min-gi adjusted his round glasses and said that the one with whom Chan Dak-chol quarreled is Lee Chol-min, the best student at Mint Academy. The guy leaned over the bench, saying that everyone says that he is very unusual. He fights with twin daggers. Kim Sojin looked at him in bewilderment, wondering why he was telling all this. He didn't even ask. Kim Sojin thought that he was really one of those who are called boring. The guy said that he knows so much. Lee Min-gi scratched the back of his head and smiled, saying that he was just interested in all sorts of things. Chan Dak-chol put his hand behind his back, grabbed the axe by the handle and sent the guy in front of him. Behind him a man with red hair asked to be quieter. Everyone turned to look at him. A guy in a black suit, red shirt and red hair looked back at them. He frowned, tilted his head and said displeasedly that actually they were not alone here. The sign showed Lee Ju-hwan was a student at Revenant Academy. Kim Sojin looked at the guy in surprise, thinking that he quickly calmed them down. Next to him Lee Min-gi lowered his head, saying that the guy with red hair was called Lee Ju-hwan, a gifted student at Revenant Academy, and in fact, the winner of this tournament. The other 2 participants who were arguing dispersed in fear. The main character turned to the guy with glasses and asked that he was a winner, not a contender for victory. Lee Min-gi answered yes, he usually does not participate in the tournament. He says that he has no need to fight with such weaklings, and apparently something happened at the academy, and they decided to send him. And since he is here, then the winner is obvious. Lee Min-gi asked if the main character had heard about the Star Sword. Kim Sojin smiled and closed his eyes, asking who doesn't know. The guy with glasses laughed and answered that it's true. He looked forward and said that they say that his granddaughter invited Lee Ju-hwan to her academy. Kim Sojun looked at him in shock and asked about Park Se-yu. The guy asked him who Park Se-yu was. The guy with glasses sighed, saying that he didn't know what the reason was, but he refused. Maybe he was very confident in himself, since he rejected the offer of the granddaughter of the Star Sword himself. Lee Ju-hwan stood with his back among the other participants, with his hands in his pockets. Kim Sojun, he thought that he was thinking. The reason was different, remembering how he asked the girl that she was offering him to enter the academy, where there was not a single student. Someone kicked the blue trash can, causing it to fly off to the side, loudly asking why he had to compete with such non-entities. Lee Ju-hwan stood with his leg raised over the bucket, while the other participants looked at him worriedly. The guy thought that if it weren't for his uncle's wish, he would have moved to the 3rd level long ago. And even if the rabble managed to win, it would still remain rabble. Victory at such a tournament will not bring him recognition. The guy with red hair clenched his teeth in anger and raised his hand, veins popping out on his face and palm as he thought that if he had known that everything would turn out this way, he would have agreed to that girl's proposal. He remembered how Park Se-yu with a wide smile said that he had great talent and did he want to enroll with her. Lee Ju-hwan with a dissatisfied face then thought that she was annoying and asked what kind of academy this was. The guy thought that he refused because he didn't want to study at some unknown academy, but still the granddaughter of the Star Sword, and he could just use her and then get rid of her. Noticing something to the side, Lee Ju-hwan turned his gaze to the side. He looked at the main character, who frowned, looking at the guy. Lee Ju-hwan thought displeasedly what kind of plebeian he was. Lee Min-gi turned to Kim Sojun, saying that he was looking at them and what they would do. Lee Ju-hwan thought how bad it was that even now such people were participating. Kim Sojun held a spear in his hands, thinking that means Park Se-yu was inviting him to himself, and I wonder what he will get for fighting him. The voice announced that the first stage of the tournament would soon begin. All the participants turned back towards the sound, and the voice told the students to prepare. Lee Min-gi turned to the main character, saying that it looks like it will start soon, and he silently stood up from his seat. Kim Sojun thought that he had been trying to achieve 30% in Chiron and Xiang Yu's lectures for the past 2 weeks, but he didn't notice much change in strength or anything else. The guy walked along a long corridor, ahead of which there was a bright light, and thought that the difference between 19% and 20% was much clearer than the difference between 20% and 21%. The guy remembered how he fought with monsters and Park Se-yu, looking at his hand, and thought that compared to the others, he lacked experience, but he tried to make up the gap by training with Park Se-yu and fighting in the dungeon. Kim Sojun clenched his hand into a fist, thinking that it didn't matter who was in front of him, a man or a monster. He smiled, raising his fist and holding a spear in his other hand, thinking that $100,000 was waiting for him. The loudspeaker announced that the first stage was a maze race. Kim Sojun stood in the middle of the maze with high walls with various cracks on them, asking about it. The blue system window showed Chiron lecture progress, 31.1%, Buddha lecture progress, 6.8%, Xiang Yu lecture progress, 33.4%. The loudspeaker announced that the first stage of the Academy tournament would begin soon. There was a huge screen in the stadium with seats for spectators around it. The people in front of the screen raised their fists in the air, waiting for the tournament to be shown. One of the people in a black suit and with a camera waved to a friend in a purple suit, saying that he was here. The man in the purple shirt displeasedly told him that he could choose seats other than the corner, bumping shoulders with the girl in the white cap. The man bowed to the girl and apologized, and she adjusted her cap and said that it was nothing. The man sat down next to the guy in a black suit and he asked with a smile if he met a friend. The man said no, looking in the direction of the girl, and she just reminds him of someone. And what's going on? The guy replied that he was now selling a race in the maze. They only said that you need to get out of the maze, and also that you can't attack other participants. No more details. There were several camera footage on the screen with various students who were standing in the maze. The guy continued that hunters must be well oriented, or they want to test their intuition. The guy said that although this is a level 4 competition, he doubts that they made an ordinary maze that the lucky one will pass. Chandak Chul ran towards the Minotaur, holding a huge axe in his hand and his mouth wide open. The guy said that most likely there were a lot of monsters there, after defeating which the students would receive clues leading to the exit. Lee Chulmin stood next to the killed monster, exhaling and holding a piece of paper in his hand. The guy said that he thought they were testing whether the participants had all the necessary skills to raid the dungeon. The man in the purple shirt put his hand to his chin and said thoughtfully that this year's students are strong. The guy next to him pointed to the screen and asked the man to look at him. Li Juechuan sat on one knee in front of two huge monsters, through which many red rays of light passed. Splashes of monster blood flew in the air. The guy looked forward. His body glowed with red light, and red sparks flew nearby. The crowd cheered and the guy in the purple shirt smiled, saying that he was clearly on another level. The guy in the suit said in shock that he didn't know much about it, but he was incredible and who he was. Another replied that it was Li Juechuan and it was obvious who would win. Park Si-yu in a white cap looked up and thought about the guy. She looked at the screen worriedly, putting her hand to her chest and thought that he had forgotten at the tournament. The man in the purple shirt turned to the girl and she awkwardly covered her face with her hand, thinking that it was impossible for anyone to understand that she was the granddaughter of the Star Sword. She wanted to watch the tournament in peace. Park Si-yu thought she was wondering about Kim Sajin, a labyrinth with a white floor and high white walls. The guy held a spear in his trembling hand, raising it. Kim Sajin put his spear in front of him and said that, as he thought, the wall could not be broken through. He lowered the spear, taking it in one hand, and said that he would have to get out like everyone else. The guy put his hand on the wall, running along it. Kim Sajin walked with his hand on the wall and said that if he used the power that lifts mountains twice, he could break the wall, and learned a couple of tricks from navigating the maze. Kim Sajin looked ahead, noticing something. In front of him there were 3 exits where he could go and the guy said that this was a fork. Kim Sajin walked forward frowning and looking at his hand. He thought that he would follow the main rule. Just stick to one side, so in the end he will find a way out. The only problem is when it comes. Kim Sajin said he would go to the left. He walked forward. Suddenly his eyes glowed with a blue light. The guy turned back, looking to the side and thought what an indescribable feeling this was. He looked at the fork and thought that he didn't understand anything. Kim Sajin turned around. On one side of the fork there was a bright blue light, and blue energy was leading there. The guy thought that it seemed to him that instead of staying on the left side, it was better to go there. He said that perhaps this is the sixth sense, intuition, which Chiron was talking about. The guy pursed his lips, frowning, his eyes glowing faintly. He walked in that direction, saying that he didn't know. Kim Sajin scratched his head, saying that he thought he should trust his intuition. The system window showed Chiron's lecture progress, 31.7%, Buddha's lecture progress 6.8%, Zhang Yu's lecture progress 33.4%. The guy frowned, looking forward and thought it was strange. The voice of the loudspeaker was heard, which said that Rock Academy student Cho Suk-min was eliminated from the tournament. The main character looked up and thought that judging by these announcements, the others were constantly fighting monsters. The guy walked forward, looking to the side and wondered why everything was quiet then. Kim Sajin's eyes widened and he frowned and wondered if his intuition really helps him get around the monsters. The guy thought that if he reaches 100% in Master's Metamorphosis, he will be able to foresee the future and stuff like how his opponent will attack in 3 seconds. Kim Sajin laughed red and Lee Min-gi approached him from behind, calling the guy brother. Kim Sajin looked forward displeasedly, thinking that this doesn't happen. It's not harmful to dream. Lee Min-gi looked worriedly at the guy, clutching a weapon in his hand, and told him to be careful, and there were monsters around every corner. The main character replied that he knew. Kim Sajin turned to the guy with glasses, thinking that he didn't think that choosing a different path would immediately meet him, though so far he hadn't seen a single monster. Only him. Lee Min-gi raised his eyebrows, looking at the guy and asked how he ended up here. Lee Min-gi looked around, holding his sword to his chest, and said that the main character walks so confidently, as if he knows the way. Kim Sajin replied that he just goes wherever he takes his fancy. The guy with glasses flinched and looked at him in shock, shouting that you can't go wherever you want, and it could end badly, and he knows how to get out of the maze. He will lead. Lee Min-gi put his hand on the wall and smiled, saying that he had heard about the left and right hand methods. You should always stick to one side. Then you will easily find a way out. Kim Sajin frowned, saying that it was too long and he should just trust his feelings. Lee Min-gi raised his hand, looking at him in confusion, and said that he would get lost like this. The guy replied that then he was proposing to split up, and why did he even follow him? Lee Min-gi adjusted his round glasses and said loudly that he was his brother in misfortune. The main character asked what? The guy with glasses smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, saying that he didn't come from the academy, but himself, and looking at him, he decided that the main character also came alone. Kim Sajin thought that that's why he spoke to him. Kim Sajin looked questioningly at the guy who said that it is better for the weak to stick together. Kim Sajin looked forward in surprise, scratching the back of his head in confusion, and thought that he was weak, and probably from the outside he looked like that. Lee Min-gi reached into his pocket and said that since he was alone, he would make an exception and do something for him which is incredible. The guy with glasses, blushing and smiling, showed his phone on which there was a photo of a little girl who was also wearing round glasses. The guy said that this was his sister and she was cute. Kim Sojin smiled awkwardly, saying what else. He turned away and walked forward, saying that she was very nice, but he went, and he was happy to chat. He hoped they would never meet again. Lee Min-gi fell to the ground and with tears in his eyes grabbed the guy's leg, asking him not to leave. The guy with glasses shouted that people like them should stick together. Kim Sojin smiled awkwardly, holding a spear on his shoulder, and thought that he was stuck. Even the awakened ones could be scared in such a place, and probably if he were younger, he would have been scared too. Lee Min-gi looked at the guy worriedly, clutching the sword in his hands, and said that traveling alone is dangerous. Kim Sojin thought that, of course, he was talking too much. But still, in the waiting room he told a lot of useful things, although still not, no matter how old he is also a participant in the tournament and his opponent. Kim Sojin turned to the guy with glasses, looking over his shoulder, and said that he keeps saying that he is alone. And didn't his parents and sister come to support him? Lee Min-gi said that his parents died and he has no one except his sister. The main character's eyes widened in surprise when he heard this. The guy remembered his apartment and how he lay there alone while no one was there. Kim Sojin silently adjusted the spear on his shoulder. He looked at the guy with glasses, who was looking at the main character with concern, thinking that he said without thinking. And he must be embarrassed now. Lee Min-gi awkwardly told the guy that it was a long time ago. He just wanted to say that his sister is still small and can't come to support him. Lee Min-gi looked at the main character in surprise when he told him that the guy was right. They were brothers in misfortune. Kim Sojin turned away and closed his eyes with a smile, saying that if he wants, they can go together. Lee Min-gi looked at him in confusion. The main character pointed his thumb at himself and, looking at the guy, said that he immediately said that they are not a team, and the prize for first place will go to him. He walked forward while Lee Min-gi looked after him questioningly. The white walls of the labyrinth. The guy with glasses shouted that then they would go together. Lee Min-gi ran with a confused face after the main character, shouting where he was running. Kim Sojin smiled widely, saying that he himself said that he would go with him. Lee Min-gi was breathing heavily, tiredly, saying that he remembers, but you can't rush headlong. The guy with glasses looked at the main character and thought that he did not hesitate at all, was too confident in himself, chose the path without even thinking. Lee Min-gi thought with tears in his eyes that he seemed to know where to go, and it was simply impossible. Kim Sojin looked ahead, noticing something. The guy stood in front of the wall and Lee Min-gi, breathing heavily, said that there was a dead end and he barely caught up. Lee Min-gi called the main character, who put his hand on the wall and frowned, saying that it looks like it's here. The guy with glasses asked what he was doing and Kim Sojin abruptly opened the white door. Lee Min-gi looked at him in surprise, eyes wide open, and asked how. The loudspeaker announced that here is the winner of the first screen. Kim Sojin and Lee Min-gi stood in front of the open door. A guy with glasses shouted loudly. On top of them there was a screen on which it was written, completion time, 27:12, previous record, 1:4:34, new record. Two guys looked at this in shock, shouting that someone had already gotten out. And who was it? Lee Ju-hwan. The other replied that no, he had a fight in full swing. Park Si-yu was peeking out from behind them. One of the men then asked, who is this? Park Si-yu looked on in shock as she stammered out Kim Sojin's name. Lee Min-gi also looked forward in shock, opening his mouth and saying the name Kim Sojin. Park Si-yu screamed that she didn't believe it. The big screen showed the bored face of the main character scratching his ear. He walked forward saying that it was a waste of time, no progress, and he never met a single monster. Lee Min-gi looked ahead in confusion, wondering how everything turned out this way, and he accidentally bumped into Kim Sojin. He just wanted to work with him as a team. The table on which the results of the first stage were written. First, Kim Sojin 27:12, second Lee Min-gi 27:16, third Lee Ju-hwan 83:7. Lee Min-gi and Kim Sojin were sitting on a bench while the other participants were discussing them among themselves. One said that the first did it in just 27, the second said that it was impossible, and what academy he was from. He replied that he was from the Dream Academy, but he for the first time he hears, and did a student from some seedy academy really win? The second asked maybe Kim Sojin is the son of some big shot. Lee Min-gi thought how could this be? Someone said that he did not expect this, and he thought Lee Ju-hwan would win, and who would have thought that he would come third? Lee Ju-hwan stood in front of the main character, who closed his eyes, holding the phone in front of him and thought that they had made noise, and do not allow you to concentrate on the lecture. Kim Sojin looked up at the guy with red hair who was looking at him with displeasure. The other students looked at them nervously, and the main character thought it was Lee Ju-hwan. Kim Sojin looked at the guy with raised eyebrows and thought, he wants to say something, and why is he looking at him like that? Lee Ju-hwan frowned, silently looking at the guy with a dissatisfied face. He turned around and smiled, saying that's all. The other participants looked at the guy in confusion when he said that the main character was just lucky. One of the participants said that this was probably true, otherwise how could a student of some incomprehensible academy win? And even enviously, if only luck would smile on him too. Other students looked laughing at Kim Sojin, who sighed, thinking that he needed to finish the lecture. A man in a white and blue jacket entered the door, asking for a moment of attention. A guy with brown hair held papers in front of him, saying that now he will announce what awaits them at the second stage. The other participants looked at the man who said that they would have to fight each other one-on-one, since they were all at the 4th level, so that everyone would be on an equal footing. It is forbidden to enhance weapons with mana. However, they can strengthen their body with it, and let they take into account that if one of the participants is unable to fight, the judge will suspend the fight. Kim Sojin looked at the employee seriously, thinking that 32 students had qualified for the second round, in which case he needs to go through 5 rounds, and he wonders who he will be matched with. The employee said that if they had no questions, they would start drawing up the tournament bracket. One of the participants raised his hand and asked for forgiveness. He said that he was withdrawing from the tournament. Kim Sojin raised his finger to his face in surprise and looked at him questioningly. Park Si-yu walked through the stadium. Looking to the side, she looked up and said that she almost got caught. She remembered shouting out the name Kim Sojin, and the man in the purple shirt pointed at her, asking who she was. The girl lowered her head and adjusted her cap, saying that she never thought he would win. The girl walked around the corner, peeking out from behind him, and thought that she would return when everything calmed down. Someone shouted how to understand this. Park Si-yu looked at how the man stood behind the counter. In front of him there were several men, one of whom shouted that they said that there would be 32 participants, and why they immediately started from the semi-finals. The man behind the counter answered that because the rest refused to participate. Park Si-yu realized that these were bets. A man with brown hair and stubble said that all the fun was ruined. The man in the hat replied that there was no point in betting now. The bald man behind the counter closed his eyes, saying that it was already obvious to everyone that Lee Ju-hwan would win. The man in the hat replied that it was so, but the odds for his victory were too small. Behind them stood a man in a black robe. A briefcase was placed on the counter, and the man said he was betting 100 million won on Kim Sojin. People looked at the man in a black robe in shock, shouting in earnest. Park Si-yu looked around the corner in confusion while someone said that the main character was just lucky, and no one had heard of his academy before. The girl wondered who he was. A man in a dark hood with purple energy flying around him. Park Si-yu wondered who he was. Kim Sojin looked forward, throwing his spear over his shoulder, and thought that he was bored. A few minutes ago, a guy in black raised his hand, saying that he was withdrawing from the tournament. The main character looked at him, asking how it was. Lee Min-gi adjusted his glasses, looking at him, and said that he heard that in 4th level tournaments this is not uncommon, and the same ones always win. The other participants were whispering while Lee Ju-hwan crossed his arms over his chest and looked at them displeasedly. One of the participants said that he heard that Lee Ju-hwan doesn't care about the rules at all, and if you fight against him, you will definitely remain crippled, and he wouldn't want to be paired with him. The other replied that they were level 4, and if they got hurt during the tournament, no one would care. Chan Dak-chol put his hand to his face, laughing maliciously. Lee Chol-min sighed and closed his eyes. One of the participants said that even without him there are serious opponents, and if they continue, they will serve as a springboard for their already famous academies. The other participants stood helplessly, saying that it was better to just give up. They ran forward, shouting in fear that they too were giving up. Kim Sojin watched the participants leave the tournament, and Lee Min-gi shook his head, looking at the guy and the participants in confusion. So there are only 5 left. Sitting in the waiting room were Kim Sojin, Lee Min-gi, Lee Ju-hwan, Lee Chol-min, and Chan Dak-chol, who smiled widely, saying that the newcomers were too weak. The first fight, Kim Sojin, who held a spear on his shoulder, and Chan Dak-chol, who smiled with his eyebrows drawn together. Between them there was a yellow verses inscription. The second fight, Lee Ju-hwan, who crossed his arms over his chest, looking over his shoulder with glowing eyes. Lee Min-gi, who was sitting on a bench. Between them was the inscription verses. Lee Chol-min stood next to him with a sad smile. The inscription is what he gets auto victory. Kim Sojin looked at the guy with round glasses, thinking that he won the first stage, and I wonder if he now makes it to the finals, regardless of the result, whether he will be first. The main character with a smile asked the guy with glasses why he was trembling. He turned around and with tears in his eyes said that he wasn't scared and would soon go out to a duel. Lee Min-gi, crying, grabbed Kim Sojun by the clothes, patted him and said that he still had to fight Lee Ju-hwan. Kim Sojun smiled at him, raising his eyebrows and said that the fight hasn't started yet and he's already on the losing side. Lee Min-gi said that it's because he knows it will happen. The main character asked why he was participating then and let him leave. The guy looked ahead with an awkward smile, confused. He lowered his head and put his hands on his lap, saying that he couldn't. The employee entered the room and told Chandak-chul and Kim Sojun to go out. He said that he asked them to enter the arena and Kim Sojun stood up with a smile, closing his eyes, saying that since he decided to fight, he needs to fight to the very end and who knows, maybe he can win. Suddenly Lee Min-gi grabbed the guy's hand. The guy with glasses stood up from his seat, looking nervously at Kim Sojun, who also turned to look at the guy. Lee Min-gi asked him in confusion if he wasn't worried. Kim Sojun smiled and knitted his eyebrows and said that of course not, and he only cares about how much experience they give for his fight. Lee Min-gi looked questioningly at the guy, asking what he was talking about. Kim Sojun walked forward, clenched his hand into a fist and said goodbye with a smile. The loudspeaker announced that they had all been waiting for this moment for a long time, and they were continuing the 63rd Academy tournament, with the second stage ahead. Kim Sojun stood in the middle of a huge stadium. Spectators were sitting around. The loudspeaker announced that now that all the losers had left, only the strongest remained, and let the spectators meet the participants in the first fight. Kim Sojun smiled, waving his hand to the crowd, while the loudspeaker said that the new record holder of the race in the maze, who beat all the monsters, talent or banal luck, the participant shrouded in mystery. The guy thought that it was a good lesson that everyone withdrew from the competition. The guy looked to the side where the second participant was saying that luck would not help him. Chandak-chul smiled broadly, throwing the axe on his shoulder. The commentator said, opponent Kim Sojun, in front of his crushing power, any tricks are useless. He will grind anyone into dust. A giant with an axe, Chandak-chul from Gachari Academy. The guy with an axe said sarcastically, what a pity that the main character won the first stage and immediately collided with him. He looked to the side, laughing loudly and smiling widely, shouting that it seemed his luck had turned away from him. Kim Sojun smiled awkwardly and answered who knows. The guy said that it was too early to judge which of them was unlucky. Chandak-chul frowned at these words and clenched his teeth. The loudspeaker said that the first match of the second stage was about to begin. Chandak-chul immediately ran towards the main character, holding an axe, and shouted that he would make him regret his words. Kim Sojun smiled and knitted his eyebrows, looking at him. Lee Min-gi sat with his head down. He looked at the TV in the waiting room and thought that the fight had started, and he wondered how Kim Sojun was doing. The guy with glasses looked at Lee Ju-hwan, who was standing against the wall, and thought that no, this is not the time to worry about others. Lee Ju-hwan stood against the wall with a gloomy look, and Lee Min-gi thought that very soon he would come face to face with him. The guy trembled, remembering the words of Kim Sojun, who told him that since he decided to fight, then let him fight to the end and who knows, maybe he can win. Lee Min-gi clenched his trembling hand into a fist and mentally cursed. He thought that this was not the case, and Chandak-chul and Lee Ju-hwan represented famous academies, and people like them were no match for them. The guy thought that he should give up before it was too late. He looked up at the screen, but Lee Ju-hwan and Lee Chul-min were looking at him in shock. Lee Min-gi looked forward in surprise, his mouth open, while the commentator said that no one expected this. The fight ended in the blink of an eye. Kim Sojun stood over Chandak-chul with his hands clenched into fists. His face was shown on the huge screen. The commentator said that Kim Sojun from Dream Academy was the winner. Lee Ju-hwan looked at the screen, displeasedly saying that worms belong to worms. The guy with red hair looked to the side, frowning. Lee Min-gi rose sharply from his seat, holding a weapon in his hands. He looked at the guy, trying to say something, a bead of sweat running down his face. The guy said that he did too. Lee Ju-hwan looked at the guy with anger, clenching his teeth. Chandak-chul shouted loudly, raising his huge axe behind his head to strike. He hit the ground sharply and the main character dodged, jumping to the side. The commentator said that you wouldn't expect anything less from Chandak-chul, a crushing force. Kim Sojun looked down at the guy's hammer as the commentator continued that he dodged the attack with ease. He said that it looks like luck is still on his side. Chandak-chul looked at the guy in shock, wondering what was wrong. He remembered how the guy dodged his blows with a smile, holding a spear in his hands, thinking that he was attacking without a break so that he himself was already exhausted, but he didn't seem to take him seriously. Beads of sweat ran down Chandakchul's face and his eyes widened as he gritted his teeth and wondered why his attacks weren't working on him. Chandakchul towered over the guy, raising his axe behind his head, his body glowing green as he shouted that let's see if he can dodge this. Kim Sajin swung his spear, knocking the huge axe out of Chandakchul's hands, sending it flying into the air. The guy looked ahead in shock, frowning. The axe behind him spun in the air and fell to the ground. He fell back, leaning on his hands and looking at the main character in front of him in shock. The commentator announced that no one expected this and the fight was over in the blink of an eye. Chandakchul sat on the ground, his body trembling, sweat running down his face as he muttered that he lost. He looked at the guy above him and muttered that he was weaker. The commentator announced the winner was Kim Sajun from Dream Academy. The main character looked at his phone with a disappointed face, sighing. Next to it was written, disappointment. The system window showed Chiron's lecture progress, +1 in total 32.7%. Buddha's lecture progress plus 0.1% in total 6.9%. Zhang Yu's lecture progress plus 1.5 in total 43.9%. Kim Sajin left the stadium, looking at his phone and said that that's all. He thought that he would get more for fighting with another student. Many also gave up. Now there will be fewer fights. The system window showed that the free pass would end in 52 days. Kim Sajin frowned. Sweat was running down his face when he realized that time was running out. What should he do? Not only would he not have time to complete the Buddha course, but also Chiron and even Zhang Yu. The guy closed his eyes, opened the door and entered the waiting room, thinking that he needed to tighten his belt in order to save up for a spear and extend the pass, and he simply had to win. Someone called the guy in the room. Kim Sajin looked at Lee Mingi, who sat down with his hands clenched into fists, and asked why he was so excited. The guy with glasses replied that he saw the fight and he turns out to be strong. The main character smiled smugly and said, "Did he say somewhere that he was weak?" Lee Mingi looked at him in shock, saying that it was true. An employee with brown hair came into the room, holding a piece of paper and told the participants in the second fight to get ready. He called the name of Lee Mingi, who looked at him in fear, trembling, and called the name of Lee Juechuan, who lowered his head and frowned as he stood up. The guy with red hair bumped his shoulder against the guy with glasses and told him to get out of the way. Kim Sajin frowned, looking after the guy with red hair. Lee Mingi lowered his head, trembling, and saying that the guy remembered what he said in the maze, that they need to stick together. Without raising his head, the guy with glasses continued that he doesn't know why. When he saw the main character, he felt a kindred spirit, and that's why when Kim Sajin beat Chandakchul, he was happy as if he had won, but at the same time he was jealous of him. The main character looked away while the guy continued that he was never lucky, and he had no talent. He was not as strong as him. Lee Mingi clenched his hand into a fist and looked at the guy, saying that he only wants to make his sister proud of him. The guy with glasses was called by name and he said in fear that he was already on his way. Kim Sajin looked after the running guy, wanting him to give his all, and he turned to the main character, agreeing. Kim Sajin smiled as he watched him leave. He said that they would meet in the final. Lee Juechuan and Lee Mingi were standing in the stadium. Their names and photos were on the big screen. In the middle was the inscription Fight 2. The guy in the green shirt put his hand to his chest and said to himself that he could and he will succeed. Lee Juechuan tisked, looking at him. Frowning, he looked at the guy with displeasure and asked him to stop mumbling, and he was infuriating. He thought that everything was infuriating him and what a humiliation it was to participate in this tournament. An employee in a yellow uniform stood between the two guys, saying that before the start of the fight he would remind them of the rules again. Lee Juechuan thought that this trash was his opponent. Lee Mingi lowered his head, listening to the rules that were explained to them. The guy with red hair frowned, looking at the guy with anger, his blue eyes glowing faintly. Lee Mingi looked at him in fear, casting a red shadow and clutching his weapon in his hands, trembling. The guy with red hair looked at him displeasedly, thinking that even now he could tell everything about him. A deer with the shadow of a predator hanging over it. Lee Juechuan thought he was prey. The deer's big green eyes reflected his fangs, and he looked forward in fear. Lee Juechuan thought that he was a useless non-entity, living only to be eaten. He was at the very bottom of the food chain. A tiger with bright blue eyes held a deer's neck in its teeth, and the guy thought that for a predator like him, he was just prey. Lee Juechuan frowned, looking at the guy from under his brows and thought that he was just lucky and needed to remind the trash where he belonged. Lee Mingi was trembling with his head down and the guy with red hair thought that he should have won both stages, naturally, because he is a head taller than all of them, and yet, trembling, the guy with glasses pursed his lips, looking at Li Juechuan with a determined look. He clenched his teeth, his face contorted with anger as he thought about what was happening. Li Juechuan held his sword in his hands, wondering if this non-entity really thinks he can defeat him. The guy asked the judge when they would start. He replied that they would be announced soon. The commentator over the loudspeaker said that it was time for the second fight of the second stage. Li Mingi looked ahead resolutely, frowning, and thought that he could handle it, just like Kim Sa-chun. Li Juechuan frowned, looking ahead with displeasure, and thought that there was no point in this tournament in the first place. The commentator started shouting. Li Juechuan quickly ran up to the guy, hitting his weapon with his sword, thinking that he would finish everything with one blow. He threw a punch at the guy, who blocked it with his sword with a surprised face. The commentator said that Li Juechuan, as always, lives up to expectations, immediately unleashed a mountain of furious, accurate blows on the enemy. Li Juechuan jumped slightly, slashing his sword at the guy's weapon again, and the commentator said that Li Mingi was tied up and he doubted he would last much longer. The guy with red hair waved his sword, raising his hand towards himself, and frowned, saying that he was just a pathetic brat. The guy hit Li Mingi in the chest with the hilt of his sword and told him to sit down and keep his head down. The commentator shouted this blow. Li Mingi opened his mouth in shock. The round glasses flew off his eyes, and a couple of drops of blood flew out of his mouth. The guy fell to his knees, bowing his head. The commentator said that Li Mingi was writhing in pain, and that's all. The guy held his chest with his hand, leaning on his sword, and thought that he could not defeat him. The guy looked in front of him in shock. Drool was running down his face, and there was a pool of blood nearby. Li Mingi thought that it didn't matter, and he was no match for him. Li Juechuan came closer to the guy and he thought, is there really nothing he can do? And he wanted his sister to be proud of him. He wanted to become as strong as Kim Sa-chun. Tears appeared in Li Mingi's eyes as he thought about being just like Kim Sa-chun. The commentator announced that Li Mingi was getting up. The guy slowly stood up while Li Juechuan looked at him in surprise. He held the sword out in front of him, frowning, blood visible on his lip as he thought that he should hit him for once. He suddenly jumped from his seat. Li Mingi stood in front of the guy with red hair, clutching his sword in both hands, and screamed loudly, thinking that he would just touch him, at least with the tip of the sword. Li Juechuan looked displeased at the tip of the sword, which was moving towards him. In the stadium, a large cloud of dust rose on the battlefield. The commentator shouted that the crowd was cheering. The winner, Li Juechuan from Revenant Academy. A guy with red hair stood in front of Li Mingi, who was lying on the ground, facing the ground. One of the spectators behind him said that this was not surprising. Another replied that that guy was no match for him, and Li Juechuan clearly did not belong in the 4th level competition. Blood flowed down Li Juechuan's cheek from a small cut, while one of the spectators said that, of course, he was still a fool, but a master of his craft. Li Juechuan looked down grimly as blood flowed from a cut on his cheek. The shocked face of the guy was visible on the screen as he stood over Li Mingi, thinking that he had hit him. The red-haired guy's eyes glowed blue and he thought he was just a vile brat. Someone behind him laughed. Someone said that Li Juechuan beat up a weakling and did not raise an eyebrow. Another said that maybe this Li Juechuan is not so tough. The guy with red hair turned back in shock, thinking that the guy had hurt him. The elite. The judge was sitting next to Li Mingi and the guy with red hair told him that he was withdrawing from the tournament. He asked how to understand him. Li Juechuan sharply kneed Li Mingi in the face while the judge looked on in shock. The guy with red hair looked at the spectators around. His face was distorted with anger as he shouted that he was sick of their circus of freaks. This tournament is a bunch of fools. They accept just anyone. That's why they can't get anything above the 4th level. The judge looked at the guy, shouting what he was doing, and the fight was already over, and if he didn't stop now, he would be forced to take action. Li Juechuan asked about measures and disqualification, saying that he had already left the tournament. He said that it's not sickening to watch these insects swarm around, hoping to become hunters. The guy put his foot on the face of Li Mingi, who was lying on the ground with his eyes closed. Li Juechuan brought his sword to the guy's face, pressing his foot on his face, and said that they were crawling, forgetting their place. Kim Sa-chun suddenly stood in front of him, blocking the blow of the guy with red hair with his spear. The guy's spear trembled as he lowered his head, said that he was waiting for them to meet in the finals, but he was tired. With a determined look in his eyes, Kim Sa-chun said that he would beat him right now if he insisted. They stood opposite each other in the center of the stadium. Li Juechuan's foot was on Li Mingi's head, and the main character told him to get out quickly. The guy with red hair asked what, holding the sword in front of his head, and the guy told him to remove his leg. Lee Ju-Hwan pressed his foot on the head of the guy in the green shirt and said that's what he means. Kim Sojin frowned, looking at the guy with anger when he said that if he doesn't want to. The protagonist swung his spear sharply in front of him, causing Lee Ju-Hwan to jump to the side. He tusked, landing to the side, and Kim Sojin crouched in front of Lee Min-gi, lifting him up and asking him how he was, if he was still conscious. Lee Min-gi muttered the name of the main character with his eyes closed, and he frowned when Lee Ju-Hwan sarcastically said how touching it was. He was going to cry. The guy with red hair frowned at him when Kim Sojin asked him if he liked looking down on people. He looked at the guy sitting next to Lee Min-gi, asking what was wrong with him, who in their right mind would put their foot on someone else's head. Lee Ju-Hwan stood in front of the guy while the audience around him looked at them and asked if he really didn't understand and was sick of some hillbilly forgetting his place. The main character displeasedly asked him that since they were worse, they couldn't dream. Lee Ju-Hwan asked about the dream, saying that he didn't think that in their time anyone believed in such fairy tales. He said that maybe he would also say that if he trains hard, he will succeed. The spectators looked at them, talking about why the judges did not intervene. Near the exit to the stadium field there were two referees, one of whom asked how not to interfere, and they urgently needed to be stopped. The other replied that this was an order from above and he himself did not understand. They could only watch. There was a man in a black hood around the corner and smiled. Park Si-yu sat in the audience seat, quietly called the main character, and looked at everything helplessly. Lee Ju-Hwan said that the guy is even stupider than he thought. He raised his hand and smiled widely evilly, saying to let him tell you how the world works. And without talent he is nothing. To achieve success, you need to follow your dreams. Here there is no place. There are only worthy and losers in the world. The main character's eyes widened as he listened to this. Lee Ju-Hwan said that this is how everything works. Kim Sojin lowered his head, holding Lee Min-gi in his arms, and thought that in truth, he himself had thought so before. The guy remembered how he worked dragging monsters and how one of them fell on him. Thinking that all these 9 painfully long years, when he endured everything just to become a hunter, he was constantly faced with the harsh reality. He hated himself for having he has neither money nor talent, hated for his helplessness. He remembered lying in the hospital with a sad face, thinking that work only helped him stay afloat, but he could not achieve more. Kim Sojin thought that there was probably nothing more pathetic than clinging to something that hard work could not achieve. How many times he asked himself how his life would have turned out if he had given up, if he had chosen a different path. Behind the main character stood Destiny in a yellow t-shirt, and the guy asked him to take care of Lee Min-gi. Kim Sojin stood up and the judge looked at the guy in surprise, thinking that he was constantly giving into fear, doubting himself. He thought that this was how many people fell into despair. Kim Sojin stood in front of the guy with red hair, asking how he felt about it. The guy's eyes widened and he raised his eyebrows, asking what he would say to this. Kim Sojin ran towards Lee Ju-Hwan, and the judge extended his hand, shouting for them to stop, and it was against the rules. Kim Sojin put his spear behind his back and spun it in the air while the referee shouted at them to stop. Lee Ju-Hwan closed his eyes and sighed. He smiled evilly, opening his eyes and looking at the guy, his eyes glowing blue as he asked, he was joking, right? The guy with red hair held his sword in front of him when the main character tried to hit him with a spear, blocking the blow. Lee Ju-Hwan smiled, looking at him, calling the guy a pathetic bug. He frowned and replied that he was also a bug. Lee Ju-Hwan swung his sword, knocking the guy back. With a mad face, he jumped forward and raised his sword back, holding it in both hands. Kim Sojin jumped to the side several times, blocking the blows of the guy with red hair who was running after him. Gritting his teeth, the main character held the spear in front of him while blows rained down on him. There were cuts from the sword on his face, and he thought that Lee Ju-Hwan is strong. And no wonder everyone thinks so highly of him. And in the fight with Chan Dak-chul he did not even doubt his victory. But now, Lee Ju-Hwan smiled as he punched forward, his eyes glowing blue, leaving a trail in the air. Kim Sojin closed his eyes, holding the spear in both hands, and mentally told himself not to think about it, and now is not the time. He just needs to go with the flow. Trust his feelings. He struck a sharp blow with his spear to the chest of the guy with red hair. His eyes widened in shock and he frowned, looking down. Kim Sojin jumped back, running his feet along the ground and resting his hand on the ground, lowering his head. Lee Ju-Hwan put his sword in front of him. The judge behind him shouted how to understand this and let them stop now. With an angry expression on his face, the guy with red hair shouted at him not to interfere. He thought that he was a predator, the top of the food chain. The main character's blue eyes glowed. He frowned at Lee Ju-Hwan, tilted his body and held a spear in his hand. The guy with red hair thought that this look, why did some weakling have the look of a predator? Li Juechuan clenched his teeth. A vein bulged on his cheek with anger, and he said that dreaming is not harmful. The guy found himself next to Kim Sajun, who looked at him in surprise. He said that they would see what happens to his dreams when he faces reality. Li Juechuan jumped over the main character, striking with his sword, which he blocked with his spear, the stones around them breaking and flying into the air. Kim Sajun's spear trembled under the sword of the guy with red hair, but Li Juechuan clenched his teeth and realized that he had blocked the blow. He dealt many more blows with his sword, which the main character blocked, and thought that he was imagining something. Kim Sajun swung his spear, knocking the guy's sword away, and he looked at him in surprise. Kim Sajun pointed his spear forward, holding it in both hands, looking forward with a determined look. Li Juechuan thought that it seemed to him that with each block he was becoming stronger, like a monster growing right before his eyes. Li Juechuan looked up in surprise, looking with his mouth slightly open. Li Juechuan was hit on the side and he made a sound of pain, lowering his head. Kim Sajun was also hit on the side and he closed his eyes. They bounced away from each other, standing on different edges of the field, a white dense cloud of fog flying around. Li Juechuan looked at the guy in front of him, clutching a sword in his hands, and thought that some brat had pushed him away. Raising the sword, the guy's face distorted with anger, and red energy appeared around the sword as he thought that this would never happen in his life. Kim Sajun looked at it in surprise, frowned, and realized that this was an aura. He thought that he still did not know how to control mana, and he had nothing to oppose it. Li Juechuan brought the sword back, from which bright red energy emanated. The guy shouted that he would kill the main character. Several people ran towards him, shouting to him to stop. Kim Sajun thought that he needed to run, and this was the surest option. He thought why he didn't want to run away then, since it would be right, and he felt that if he ran away, he would betray everything he had learned. Suddenly, Zhang Yu's voice was heard, and the guy's eyes widened when he told him that he was surrounded by the army of the Chu Kingdom. He was already telling how their cries and songs could be heard from all sides. Zhang Yu stood back to back with the main character, saying that one day a student asked him why he then rushed at the enemy. The man crossed his arms over his chest, standing with his back to the main character, saying that the outcome of the battle was already a foregone conclusion. Li Juechuan ran towards Kim Sajun, holding a sword behind his back, glowing with a red aura. Zhang Yu continued that it was so. He lost, and this could not be changed, and honestly, then for the first time he felt despair. He was afraid of defeat scared him the most. Kim Sajun squeezed the spear in his hand, causing a vein to swell on his hand. Zhang Yu said that he still rushed into battle because it was simply necessary. He said that even if everything points to defeat, you need to fight like a beast and believe in your victory. And even with the power to lift mountains, you cannot win forever. This is the true spirit of a warrior. Zhang Yu said that Zhang Yu, fought and lost, and that is why he became the hegemonic king. Kim Sajun clenched his teeth. Blue energy emanated from his spear. Behind him with a wide smile was Zhang Yu, with green energy flying around him. The power that rips mountains out of the ground will erase any barriers. The spirit that can turn the whole world will dominate him. Li Juechuan and Kim Sajun ran at each other while holding their weapons. The guy with red hair clenched his teeth and trembled with anger. He looked furiously towards the main character, with a crazy face asking him not to make him laugh. He is a predator here, and they are his bedding on which he can wipe his feet. The guys ran towards each other. Li Juechuan's weapon emanated a red aura that stretched back, and Kim Sajun's weapon had a blue aura. Two people in black suits were running towards the two of them. With a crazy face, raising his weapon back, the guy with red hair shouted to the other one to die already. Kim Sajun raised his spear above his head and, opening his mouth wide, screamed loudly. They struck each other. Beams of red and blue energy shot through the air, a powerful impulse running through the air, causing the spectators in their seats to cover their faces. A bright white light could be seen in the center of the stadium, and the impulse spread throughout the entire stadium. A white dense fog was flying in the air. Two people in black suits sat on the ground, looking forward in shock. There were fragments of stones nearby. One of them said that because of the dust nothing was visible. Two figures of guys were visible in a dense white cloud of dust. One of the employees asked which of them won. Kim Sajun raised his head as the dust cleared. He leaned on his spear, and Li Juechuan fell in front of him, raising his sword. Kim Sajun leaned on his spear with shaking hands and lowered his head. Li Juechuan was lying on the ground with his cheek turned white, and blood was dripping from his mouth, leaving a bloody stain on the ground. They stood in the center of the stadium. The dust cleared. The spectators looked at them. The stadium erupted with cheers from the crowd as Kim Sojun stood on his feet in front of the red-haired guy lying on the ground, his black sword lying next to his hand. The audience raised their fists in the air as they watched Kim Sojun win. They chanted his name as the guy stood there, breathing heavily. Behind him, Park Se-yu looked at the guy in shock. She opened her mouth, looking forward in surprise, and thought that 2 weeks ago he could barely block a blow soaked in mana, and now he was using aura. The girl smiled weakly nervously and thought about the guy. Someone nearby shouted that this couldn't be. Park Se-yu turned around. On the stairs in the middle of the audience stood a man in a black cloak and hood. She thought that she had seen him in the bookmaker's office. The man opened his mouth slightly, asking how in shock. He trembled. The hood fell from his head. Under him there was a guy with brown hair and brown eyes. He grabbed his chest and shouted that this was impossible. Park Se-yu sat in the audience seat next to him, thinking that she, of course, was also surprised, but not as much, and as if Kim Sojun had broken the laws of the universe before his eyes. Park Se-yu lowered her gaze, thinking that this was by the way. She turned back, thinking that he had bet on the main character to win. The man in the cloak was no longer in his original place. Park Se-yu made a surprised sound as she looked back from her seat as she said that he had already left. The sky turned orange from the setting sun. Kim Sojun walked along the road with his head down. The guy's face seemed tired and upset. He looked down. There were 2 bandages on his face. The guy recalled standing in front of an employee in a black suit who told him he was disqualified. With a shocked face, Kim Sojun listened as the employee said that they admit that Lee Ju-hwan behaved in an inappropriate manner, but he had already withdrawn from the tournament, and he intervened as a participant. The judge warned him of the consequences, but he did not listen. The man closed his eyes and shook his head, saying that with his actions he violated the rules of the tournament. Kim Sojun closed his eyes and smiled sadly, thinking that there was no arguing here, but why didn't anyone stop him before he intervened? The guy said that it was okay and he understood what he was getting into and what was wrong with Lee Ju-hwan. Employees in orange uniforms put a guy with red hair on a stretcher. A man in a black suit stood next to him. He replied that of course Lee Ju-hwan was also disqualified, although he was no longer participating. Lee Ju-hwan's face was distorted. His mouth was open and his eyes were white. The man continued that enhancing the sword with an aura is regarded as attempted murder. However, he will not go to trial, but the Hunters Association will prohibit him from taking the exam for the next 5 years. The automatic winner was Lee Chol-min. Second place was taken by Lee Min-gi, and third place by Chan Dak-chol. Kim Sojun walked along the road looking at his phone, saying that the main thing is that the progress is good. In the corner on the pedestal there were 3 winners. Next to it was the inscription Lucky. The guy thought that victory without a fight is a true victory. The blue system window on which was written, Chiron Lecture Progress plus 15 only 48.7%. Buddha Lecture Progress plus 5.2 only 12.1%. Zhang Yu Lecture Progress plus 20% only 56.9%. Kim Sojun thought that after the fight with Lee Ju-hwan, the experience simply skyrocketed, and according to Zhang Yu's lectures it's already even more than 50%. Looking down at his phone, the main character remembered how Zhang Yu helped him in battle, thinking that if he thought like that incomprehensible power that he felt in battle could manifest itself just because the progress had exceeded 50%. The guy looked at the phone with a black screen, thinking that he could sign up for another course, and the higher the progress, the easier everything would be. Suddenly someone tapped him on the shoulder. Park Se-yu looked in surprise at the guy behind him, calling, and he turned to the girl, greeting her. The girl worriedly extended her hands to the guy, asking how he was and whether it hurt much. He stretched his hand and said that he was fine. He might look like a weakling, but in reality he was quite strong. Park Se-yu sighed with a smile, putting her hand to her chest, and Kim Sojun sadly looked at the girl in silence. He asked her for forgiveness and she looked at the guy in surprise, asking why. Kim Sojun closed his eyes, clenched his hands into fists, and said that he would have won if he had not interfered. Park Se-yu raised her hands and said that he had nothing to apologize for. She said that she just wanted to know if he was okay. The guy looked at her in surprise, opened his mouth and asked if he shouldn't be. Park Se-yu replied that he was counting on a cash prize, or it seemed to her. Everything around the main character turned black, and he looked at her with the same expression. Kim Sojun grabbed his head and raised his head up, screaming exactly. The girl thought that he really forgot. The guy with a disappointed face talked about Longshan's spear, and what should he do, because he still needs to renew his pass. Park Se-yu looked at him in surprise, asking what he wanted to spend the money on. Kim Sojun squatted on the ground, scratching his head with a sad look, and said that he liked one spear and really wanted to buy it. the main character with a spear in his hands and a crazy face, who laughed and talked about 100 million won. Next to the inscription, Kim Sojun in the eyes of Park Si-yu. The guy got up from his seat and said that it was okay. The girl looked at him in surprise. The main character looked down with a sad smile and said that he would be lying if he said that he did not regret anything. But the truth is, if he had not intervened, he would have regretted much more. Park Si-yu looked at the guy in surprise. Her mouth parted. Kim Sojun scratched the back of his head, saying that he was sure that the problem with money would somehow be solved, and Lee Min-gi waved his hand next to him, calling the guy. There were bandages on his head and his glasses were broken. Several bandages were visible on his face, and he raised his hand up, calling out to the main character again. Lee Min-gi leaned on his knees and, panting heavily, asked if he was already leaving. Kim Sojun turned to him and said that he was getting ready. The guy with glasses awkwardly scratched his head, unable to find words, and the guy looked at him questioningly. Pursing his lips, the guy with glasses lowered his head and swallowed. He looked at Kim Sojun standing opposite him and asked if he could become as strong if he trained hard. The main character looked at him in surprise. His eyes widened. He looked at the guy with glasses who looked at him determinedly, trembling. Kim Sojun opened his mouth, wanting to say something. He honestly answered that it would not be easy, and Lee Min-gi and Park Si-yu looked at him in surprise. The main character thought that, in truth, Lee Min-gi clearly lacks the talent to become a hunter, and of course, they say that everything can be achieved if you work hard, but the world is cruel, you won't get far on dreams and ideals alone. Kim Sojun looked at the guy with glasses, standing opposite him, and said that you shouldn't focus on becoming a hunter. You can do something else, and he's still young, there's plenty of time, so don't be upset. Lee Min-gi smiled awkwardly at him, looking at the guy, and said that he was right about something. The guy awkwardly scratched the back of his head and said that he didn't want to spoil anyone's mood. He just came to say goodbye. White buildings of the city, the sky painted in orange sunset color. Lee Min-gi turned around, leaving the main character and Park Si-yu, thanking him for everything. Kim Sojun frowned at the guy and shouted at him not to let anyone tell him what to do, be it him or anyone else. Kim Sojun looked at the guy's back, shouting to him that he had no talent, and nothing could be done about it, so they would tell him. They would say that he could not cope and that only failures awaited him. The main character clenched his hands into fists, and Lee Min-gi slowly turned to face him. The guy continued, so that he does not forget, no one's opinion should become his reality. Kim Sojun shouted that if he wants something, let him do it, and nothing else matters. Lee Min-gi looked over his shoulder, biting his lip, tears running down his face. Lee Min-gi waved to the main character with both hands, shouting that he would visit him with his sister someday. Kim Sojun waved back with a smile. The guy smiled awkwardly as he walked past Park Si-yu, who said with a smile that she was pleasantly surprised. The guy replied that he always pokes his nose into other people's affairs. The girl laughed, raising her hand to her face and closing her eyes. She said that she didn't see anything wrong with it. Besides, he had his first fan. Kim Sojun answered her with a smile that another student would be better than just a fan. He said that he needed to take advantage of the moment and invite him to their academy, and Park Si-yu froze in surprise. She turned around, looking after the guy who was walking along the road. The main character ruffled his hair with his hand without turning to look at her. Park Si-yu smiled and blushed slightly, saying that this is their academy. She smiled broadly, raised her hand and told the guy that he had done a good job, and she would buy him a new spear. Kim Sojun was surprised and asked seriously, and why was she suddenly? The girl replied that she should consider it instead of a scholarship. And there is a store here that his very grandpa loves. They can go there. Kim Sojun told her not to think that he would choose something cheap. Kim Sojun and Park Si-yu walked along the road together, looking at each other. The house was in a traditional style with a stone fence around it. A man in black pants walked along the wooden floor. Other people turned to look at him in surprise. A man in a black suit asked another guy in the same suit if he had a master. He replied that yes, but he was meditating, and asked not to disturb him. The figures of two men were visible behind the door, where a man was sitting in the lotus position. One of the men replied that the matter was urgent, and let him say that he was waiting for him. The wooden sliding door opened, letting light from the street into the room. A man in a suit was sitting on his knees at the aisle, who did not have a left hand, with a determined look. He said that it was he, Seo Moon-chul. The window showed that Seo Moon-chul is the right hand of the star sword. A man with a gray beard and hair stood with his back to him, telling the man that he told him not to bother him. purple energy was flying around Seo Moon-chul and Park Min-chul in the room, and the man asked how dare he ignore his orders. Seo Moon-chul closed one eye, breathing heavily, sweat running down his face when he thought that this was a monstrous pressure, and he could not move. The man muttered that Park Seo participated in the academy tournament. Park Min-chul looked over his shoulder at him. Behind the doors, another employee in a suit was trembling when a man with gray hair asked about her participating in the tournament, and Seo Moon-chul answered in the affirmative. He said that they haven't figured everything out yet. Park Seo held a spear in front of the main character with a smile, asking how he did it. Seo Moon-chul said that it looks like the girl has a new student. Kim Sojin closed his eyes and put his hand to his chin and replied that this is also not good. Seo Moon-chul looked at Park Min-chul, who stood up from his seat and said that he could figure it out on his own, but the man replied in the negative. The man with gray hair looked to the side, running his finger through his beard, saying that he personally should see what the student was like. Next to the sign showed the star sword, Park Min-chul. The academy building is a dream. Someone was counting down 4980, 4981. Kim Sojin held a spear in both hands, waving it. He swung his spear, hitting the ground with it, and counted out 5,000. The guy wiped his forehead with his hand and said that the daily task was completed. Park Seo stood silently behind him. The girl looked at the guy with displeasure, standing behind him, and he smiled awkwardly. The guy turned to her, asking why she was looking at him so dissatisfied. Park Seo replied that it seemed to him. She smiled gloomily and replied that he wanted a new spear so much. He chose it so meticulously, and in the end he left with nothing. She remembered how they stood at the counter when the guy said that he would rather leave his old spear. Kim Sojin sighed and closed his eyes, said that he was to blame, and replied that he simply did not deserve such a gift. Park Seo pointed her finger at the guy, looking at him displeasantly, and said that he is a liar, and he is clearly not the type to refuse such things. The guy smiled nervously, thinking that she saw right through him, and since he saw the weapon created by the Transcendence, he cannot look at the ordinary. The guy thought about the Spear of Longinus. He remembered with tears in his eyes how he stood in front of the system window, thinking that it was all because of these calculations. On the window it was written, Spear of Longinus, 120,001. The guy said that why buy a spear if he can ask for 20 million in cash, but why has the price increased? Isn't it possible? Kim Sojin thought helplessly that it seems that money not earned through honest labor does not count, and now he is afraid to do anything at all. Park Seo crossed her arms over her chest and frowned, saying that she said that she would pay, and this chance comes once in a lifetime. The girl silently looked at the guy, opening one eye. She asked what kind of mana enhancement technique he had. He looked towards Park Seo and asked about mana enhancement. The girl extended her hand, saying that he couldn't use magic without her, and she personally saw how he broke through the armor of monsters, and judging by the way he fought in the tournament, his technique was clearly not low class. She said that she had never seen him train her. Kim Sojin looked at the girl in surprise, thinking that he didn't know a single mana enhancement technique. A blue-colored man with purple and blue mist flying around him. The guy thought that the mana enhancement technique was a technique that allows one to use mana most efficiently. He thought that there are many different types of this technology, and depending on the effectiveness, they are divided into lower and higher class equipment. The guy around him was a gray fog. Next to him was a speedometer that showed a red icon and the number 5. Another guy, around of which there was blue energy. Next to him on the speedometer the number 1 showed. Many papers on which a special technique from the famous hunter was written and patented. All overwhelming mana enhancement techniques of the highest class. Pumpkin Hunter Academy. Kim Sojin thought that every hunter has his own mana enhancement technique. Some even patent it. The guy looked at the girl in front of him, thinking that this was why he wanted to get into the elite academy. He asked her if she accidentally taught the Star Sword mana enhancement technique. Park Seo shook her head and replied that grandfather forbids it. The guy smiled awkwardly, thinking that it was not surprising. Otherwise there would be crowds of students here. The girl gasped and asked him if he wanted to learn her technique. He asked in surprise. She created her own technique. The girl replied, yes, she always wanted to teach. Park Seo put her hands on her hips. A golden light shone around her and she asked why he was asking. Kim Sojin awkwardly scratched the back of his head and closed his eyes and replied that he was just wondering. He thought that she had no talent at all, or she simply lives in the shadow of the Star Sword. The guy pursed his lips, looking at her, and thought that she was right. A hunter is nowhere without mana. And in the battle with Li Juechuan he felt the hard way the difference in strength between those who know how to use it and those who don't. Kim Sojin put his hand to his chin and looked away, thinking that since he had a window freed up for a new lecture, why not take some course on mana? Park Si-yu looked at the guy, thinking that maybe she was something. I asked the difficult question whether he wouldn't even say anything. She waved her hand and walked back, closing her eyes and thinking that there was nothing to be done. Let him remain silent. The girl wished him good luck with the training. Kim Sojin looked after her and asked where she was going. The girl replied that she was on business. Kim Sojin smiled and closed his eyes and asked what she was doing. And she was so busy, the girl waved her fist at him displeasedly and said if he leaves before she returns, let him close the door. Kim Sojin waved his hand at the girl with a wide smile and told her not to worry. As soon as she left, the protagonist's face became serious and he thought about what course he should take. The guy closed his eyes with a sad smile and wondered where Mentor was when he needed him so much. He remembered how he gave him a thumbs up and said that he would be back as soon as he checked the profile. Park Si-yu blushed deeply as she walked away from the academy building and wondered if she really looked like she had nothing to do, and she had lately. But still, someone asked what mana is. In a world that obeys the laws of cause and effect, mana is capable of destroying the laws of the universe. That's what it is. In a large library, among mountains of books, sat a man in a long blue robe and a pointed hat. In his hands was white staff. The man's hair and long beard were gray, and an open book was flying nearby. Blue energy was also flying around him. The system window showed, "You know mana, you know the world, Professor Archmage Merlin." Kim Sojin nervously looked at his phone, frowning and holding it in front of his face. The system window showed, "You know mana, you know the world, Professor Archmage Merlin. Upon completion the student will receive a Mentor S." The guy looked sadly at his phone. The old man in the hat smiled, saying that that's all. It couldn't be simpler. The main character thought that it looked like his lectures will also make him go crazy, almost like with Buddha. The man on the phone in the guy's hands said that enough explanations. Merlin said that it was time to practice. Kim Sojin frowned, looking at his phone. A system window appeared above him, on which it was written, "Daily task, create 1000 mana spheres, 0 out of 1000. The guy said that again, a daily task. He brought his palms to each other and said that we should at least try. Kim Sojin closed his eyes and blue energy appeared around his body. The guy frowned, his clothes fluttering with energy, when he thought that sensing and controlling mana is not so difficult. And he thinks that it's all thanks to Chiron's lectures, but it's still not easy. Although he can feel mana, he can't shape it, and how he can create these spheres. The guy stood with his eyes closed. Behind him Merlin also closed his eyes, raising his hand to his face. He said that with the help of mana you need to connect your mind with the outside world, and he transfers the figment of his imagination into reality, deceiving her and convincing her that everything is happening according to the laws of nature. The guy's eyes widened when Merlin said that the most striking example of this is a force that does not exist anywhere in nature. A man with a white beard opened his eyes. In front of him was a bright blue ball. Blue energy emanated from the man, an inscription, a manifestation of mana in the form of an aura. In front of Kim Sojin a small bright sphere appeared between his hands and the guy looked at it in surprise. The guy looked in shock at the sphere between his hands, stuttering and saying that it was her. A bright sphere that cast blue light from itself. Kim Sojin shouted that it was a sphere of mana. He held the small sphere between his hands in surprise, with his legs spread apart. The guy looked questioningly at the small sphere above his hand, which was shaking. He looked at her sadly, saying that he doubted that she would be counted. Merlin said displeasedly, "And he calls this the sphere of mana." Kim Sojin looked displeased at the small trembling clot of mana, thinking that he was sure that over time he would do better. Park Min-chul appeared behind the guy, calling him out with clenched fists, and the main character turned to the man in surprise. He turned to face him questioningly, saying he is a star sword. Park Min-chul looked at the guy with a frown and pursed lips, thinking that he had come to see who had entered Park Si-yu Academy. The man looked at the shocked guy, who was still holding a small clot of mana above his hand, thinking that if his senses do not deceive him, then he has a clot of mana in his hand, and this is not easy to create. He may look stupid, but he is not lacking in talent. Park Min-chul looked at the guy with displeasure, lowered his head and thought that there was only one reason why such a gifted guy entered the Park Si-yu Academy. He wants to use her granddaughter. Dark purple energy was flying in the air and Park Min-chul said threateningly. He asked who the guy was. Kim Sojin blankly replied that he was glad to meet you, saying his name. The guy smiled, closing his eyes and thought that it was somehow scary, and who would have known that Grandfather Star Sword would be here. He said that he had only seen him on the internet. It was just amazing that he could finally meet him in person. The guy asked what he probably called CU, calling the girl by name. He said that she left for some business. Park Min-chul opened his mouth in shock and asked he called her CU. Kim Sojin questioned what was wrong. The gray-haired man's eyes widened with rage. He looked at the guy, asking why he was still standing. Kim Sojin looked at the man in surprise, opening his mouth and asking what he was talking about. Dark purple energy was flying around and the man, clenching his hand into a fist, said that his lust for murder, which was in the air, paralyzes everyone below S-class. Kim Sojin looked around, thinking that he could really resist her because of his unshakable heart. Park Min-chul ordered the guy to answer what he needed here. Kim Sojin looked at him in confusion, saying that he did not understand the man. Park Min-chul walked forward, placing his hand on his katana, saying that with such talent he would have been accepted into any academy. But he decided to get closer to Park Cu and why. The man's eyes glowed with blue light. Blue energy was flying around. The man said that he should not even think of lying. Kim Sojin covered his face with his hands. He put his hands in front of him, shook his palms and said in fear that it seemed to him that he had misunderstood him. Park Min-chul said that he didn't think that he would get an answer so easily. The main character's eyes widened and he thought that it was dangerous. Park Min-chul swung his katana sharply, delivering a blow followed by a blue light from the blow. Kim Sojin fearfully jumped to the side, dodging it. The man frowned at the guy, pursing his lips, a vein popping out on his forehead. The guy looked back at the man in fear, his mouth open in shock. Traditional style home. Park Cu asked Grandpa to leave. She stood in front of the employee, asking when he would return. She answered the girl that he did not say exactly, and she thought the chairman knew more. She could call him. Park Cu sadly looked away and pursed her lips, thinking that she just wanted to tell him about Kim Sojin, where grandfather could have gone. Park Min-chul advanced towards the guy who was sitting on the floor holding a katana, blue energy glowing around him, and the man told him to answer now. The man asked what his purpose was. Kim Sojin frowned at him while sitting on one knee and holding a spear in his hand. Park Cu looked at someone in confusion, asking if Grandpa had left. The worker in front of her replied that the foreman was not here, and the chairman knew more. She could call him. Park Cu sadly looked forward, pursing her lips and thought that this was bad. She wanted to keep everything secret for as long as possible. But after participating in the tournament, hiding Kim Sojin would no longer work. The girl thought that she decided to deal with the problem. The girl asked the worker to ask the chairman. A man in a black suit came up from behind and called Park Cu. The girl realized that this was the chairman. Seo Moon-chul approached her with a wide smile, closed his eyes and said that this was the meeting. She had not looked at them for a long time. The worker bowed and said that it was just in time. She was about to call. Seo Moon-chul asked in surprise why to call. Park Cu said that she came to her grandfather. The man in the suit swallowed. He told her that the master had gone to her academy. Park Cu's eyes widened in shock when she heard this. She suddenly turned around and ran back. Seo Moon-chul and the worker looked at her in shock. The woman in the purple jacket put her hand to her cheek and worriedly asked where she had run away. The man silently looked after her. Park Cu quickly ran forward, thinking how she could let her guard down. She knew that he would come, but she didn't think it would be so soon. The girl frowned, a bead of sweat running down her cheek as she thought that she shouldn't let this happen. Kim Sojin frowned at the man in front of him. Park Min-chul looked down at the guy with a gloomy expression on his face. Park Cu thought that it was impossible for these two to meet without her. A cloud of dust was flying in the room. The main character was sitting on one knee, holding a spear in his hand in front of the man. Kim Sojin looked ahead in confusion, raising his eyebrows and wondering how to understand this. He looked at the sword in Park Min-chul's hand, thinking that it was in its sheath and he didn't even pull the sword out of it. The guy pulled his hand back, holding the spear and looking at the man, thinking that it looked like he wasn't trying to kill him, but rather just pacify him. Park Min-chul asked who he really was. Kim Sojin put his hands in front of him and said in confusion that he really didn't understand what he needed and that he probably misunderstood something. The man answered him that he controls mana, and the main character looked at him in fear, his mouth wide open. Park Min-chul lowered his head and closed his eyes, saying that he also moves perfectly in battle and continues to claim that he understood something wrong. The man sharply struck with his sword, shouting that he was lying in his face without hesitation. Kim Sojin put his spear in front of him, blocking the blow. He jumped back, holding his spear behind his back, and said that he doesn't know what Park Cu told him, but he asks the man to calm down. The man swore at him and the guy looked at him nervously, beads of sweat running down his face as he thought that he seemed to have said something wrong and didn't understand what. Park Min-chul's eyes glowed blue. There was a dark fog around when he said that he was going to discuss everything. Take into account the circumstances that brought him here, Kim Sojun thought that he was lying, and he was not going to discuss anything with him. Kim Sojun pursed his lips, a bead of sweat running down his cheek. The guy stood on his feet, holding the spear defensively in both hands, and thought that he didn't care anymore. He frowned, looking at the man, and thought that he would not listen to him. But from his movements it was clear that no matter what he said, he would not kill him. Kim Sojun thought that if the Star Sword really wanted to kill him, he would have done it the moment he sensed its presence. Park Min-chul stood with a serious face, his eyes glowed with a faint blue light, and behind him was a blue dragon, whose eyes glowed with a golden light. The main character thought that he was the one who was higher than the stars themselves, the Star Sword. He and the man stood opposite each other while dust flew in the air, and Kim Sojun thought that he was the person who was closest to his ideals, and he just had a wonderful chance. Kim Sojun smiled, a blue light emanating from his eyes and weapon as he looked forward with determination. Park Min-chul frowned and looked at the guy with displeasure, thinking that he was a scoundrel. He held a sheathed sword in his hands, looking at the guy in front of him, from whom blue energy emanated, and thought that his mood had changed. The eyes of the man and Kim Sojun glowed with the same blue light, and Park Min-chul thought that he had seen many hunters in his life, but only one looked into his eyes without fear. The man suddenly rushed forward, and the guy looked to the side in surprise. Park Min-chul thought that he must be very strong. He swung a blow at the protagonist, who blocked it with his spear, thinking what he wanted from his granddaughter. Kim Sojun clenched his teeth and closed one eye, the spear in his hands trembling as he thought he couldn't see or feel the man's attacks. The guy's eyes widened, beads of sweat running down his face. Looming over him was the huge figure of Park Min-chul, whose eyes glowed with blue light and a blue mist hung in the air. Kim Sojun clenched his teeth, looking at this in shock and fear, holding the spear in front of him and thinking that he did not notice such a simple blow, and its power is clearly beyond Kim Sojun's understanding. The main character swung his spear several times, fighting off blows that came from different directions, frowning and wondering how much longer he could hold out. Kim Sojun suddenly jumped forward at Park Min-chul, who was standing calmly in front of him, holding his sword in front of him. The guy tried to strike. The man calmly blocked the guy's blow with his sword, frowning at him, pursing his lips. He sharply swung his sword hand to the side, aiming for the guy's side. Park Min-chul turned away, pushing the guy back with a powerful blow and closing his eyes, said that this was banal. He said that the main character only needed to answer. Kim Sojun flew back, closing his eyes and stretching his hands forward. He thought that something was wrong and something was missing. He thought that it was impossible for it to end there and he needs to hold out at least a little longer. Kim Sojun fell on the floor of the hall. The spear lay next to him, and dust rose in the air. He thought that tricks would not help him, but as long as he was not serious, he had a chance. Kim Sojun rose from the floor again. Taking his spear, he looked forward determinedly, beads of sweat running down his face. He raised his head, looking at the man who loomed over him. Park Min-chul raised his sword behind his back. His blue eyes glowed, and the main character realized that he would only have one chance, and he needed to finish everything with one blow. Kim Sojun frowned at the man and thought about how he could do this. Park Min-chul hit him hard in the face and the guy fell back, closing one eye. He landed on his feet, clenching his teeth and tilting his body back, swinging his spear wide in his hand as the man swung his sword. Kim Sojun's spear and eyes glowed blue. Merlin stood behind him, telling him to use mana, subjugate it to willpower, deceive, convince the world that the figment of his imagination obeys the laws of nature. The blue energy around the main character's body and spear became stronger, and Park Min-chul looked down at him in surprise. Clenching his teeth, Kim Sojun frowned, thinking that he was not capable of more now. The guy struck with his spear, which left behind a bright blue glow of energy. The guy hit and a powerful explosion of blue energy passed in front of him. It flew in the air, dust rose from the floor. Drops of blood were visible in the air. Park Min-chul held his sword, lowering it. The main character fell to his knees in front of him, who lowered his head. The man looked down at the guy, clutching a sword in his hand, looking at him with a frown. Kim Sojun wiped his face with his palm, opening one eye and looking up, thinking it was painful. Park Min-chul called him a scoundrel. The man's face was distorted with anger and he shouted loudly that he had finally shown his true face. Kim Sojun looked at the man with displeasure. A vein bulged on his cheek when he said in response that what else is his true face. He was the first to attack. The guy closed his eyes and frowned, saying that talking only hurts more and when we'll see you come back. Park Min-cheol's eyes turned white in shock and he opened his mouth. A red thread nearby broke when he realized that the main character called the girl by name again. The huge blue dragon with bright golden eyes appeared behind Park Min-cheol. He headed towards the guy, saying that since he was asking for it. The man looked at Kim Sejun in rage, saying that he would personally send him to the next world. The main character clenched his teeth and fearfully put his spear in front of him, realizing that he was finished. The door suddenly opened. Park Se-yu stood there, shouting contentedly. She stood in front of Park Min-cheol and Kim Sejun, who turned to look at her and asked what they were up to. Park Se-yu was breathing heavily, gritting her teeth, her face red and sweat dripping down as she called out to her grandfather.